On April 18, 1992, a person in California turned their shower on and waited until the steam was rising up out of the stall before they stepped inside. Once under the water, this person grabbed a can of shaving cream and applied it to their entire body. And slowly, they began shaving off every hair on their body except for the hair on their head. After they were done, they hopped out of the shower, they toweled off, got dressed, and then began the next phase of their prep, packing their backpack with things like latex gloves and plastic sheets. After they were done, they climbed into bed and set their alarm for very early the next morning. They were nervous about what was going to happen the next day, but they were confident that they were ready. 24 hours later, and what this hairless person had done was all over the news. But before we get into that story, I want to tell you about my absolute favorite storytelling show. It's called Bedtime Stories, and it's truly one of the most entertaining and mind-bending, terrifying shows I have ever heard, and they have a truly incredible storyteller. And here's a bit of exclusive news. It's been handpicked by me to become our very first non-MrBallen hosted podcast under the Ballen Studios banner. And the show is live right now with the first 3 episodes. You can listen to Bedtime Stories right here on Amazon Music. So, if that's of interest to you, right before the Amazon review button lays down to go to bed, put on my new favorite show, Bedtime Stories, and scare the absolute crap out of it. Okay, let's get into today's story. On Friday, April 17, 1993, 59-year-old millionaire Dale Ewell was flying his Beechcraft Bonanza single-engine airplane thousands of feet above Fresno, California. Dale was a handsome man with blue eyes and dark hair that was starting to turn gray. He was flying his plane from where he lived in Fresno to a small airport about 45 minutes away because he was going to meet his wife and kids at the family's beach house for Easter weekend. In the cockpit, Dale looked out at the clear blue sky and listened to the hum of the plane's engine, and suddenly any stress he might have been dealing with just kind of disappeared. Airplanes had been a huge part of Dale's life for almost 40 years, and he never felt better than when he was flying. In the 1950s, Dale had flown twin-engine turboprop planes as a member of the United States Air Force, and then after he left the military, Dale had gotten a job selling small airplanes to private pilots and California ranchers for a company owned by a man named Frank Lamb. Frank had taken Dale under his wing and taught him everything he could about the airplane industry, and Dale had turned out to be a very gifted airplane salesman. Part of Dale's skill as a salesman was that he was very charming, and he felt comfortable talking to all kinds of people, but really the main reason Dale had been so successful at selling planes was because his love of being a pilot really rubbed off on people. And when he talked to potential clients about the peace and the awe he felt when he was flying, they wanted to experience the same thing. And so Dale had quickly moved up the company ladder, and when Frank had stepped away from the business 20 years earlier, Dale had taken over and become the owner and president of the company. Once Dale was in charge, he had started making a lot of money, and he invested that money really well. So in 1992, as Dale approached his 60th birthday, he was worth about $8 million, which would be over $17 million in 2023. When Dale got to be about 20 miles away from the airport where he was going, he radioed air traffic control and got clearance to make his final approach. Dale descended to an altitude of about 2,000 feet and then started the landing procedure. And when he touched down on the runway, he was already looking forward to flying again in a couple of days. But first, he was eager to spend some time relaxing with his family. Dale got into a car that he had arranged to have waiting for him at the airport, and then he drove a few miles to Pajaro Dunes, a small upscale beachfront community in Northern California. He made his way down a secluded street, past large homes that looked out onto the Pacific Ocean, and then finally he pulled up to his own beach house, he parked his car, and stepped outside. His wife, Glee, and his daughter, Tiffany, were sitting on the porch waiting for him. Glee and Tiffany had driven to the beach house together the day before. Glee, who had short brown hair and a big smile, stood up and kissed her husband when he stepped onto the porch. Glee and Dale had been married for 31 years, and when they had started making a lot of money, Glee had really committed herself to community service and philanthropy. And so as a result, back in Fresno where they lived, Glee was admired as a community leader. But Glee had a past that most people in Fresno didn't know anything about. She was extremely smart and she had a talent for speaking foreign languages. And in the late 1950s, before she and Dale had gotten married, Glee's skills had landed her a job in South America as a translator for the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, which is a federal agency in the United States that specializes in foreign intelligence. Glee's children thought it was exciting that their mom had once worked for the CIA, but Glee thought about her time in South America like it was from a different life. On the porch, Glee and Dale's daughter, Tiffany, got up and hugged her dad. Then she opened the door, and they all went inside the beach house. Tiffany was 24 years old, with cropped blonde hair and a smile that was almost identical to her mother's. She was quiet and reserved around people she didn't know, and in fact, she'd been named the shyest person in class when she was in college. But Tiffany's family and her few close friends knew she was funny and sweet and a great person to talk to once she'd let her guard down. So Dale, Glee, and Tiffany spent a lot of that day just talking to each other, and their main topic of conversation was the youngest member of the family, Dana, and his new girlfriend, Monica Zent. The two had met at their dorm at Santa Clara University, which was a little over an hour from the beach house. And the next day, Dana was supposed to bring Monica out to the beach house to meet the rest of his family. The following morning, 20-year-old Dana Ewell pulled up to the front of the beach house in his gold Mercedes-Benz, and he, along with his girlfriend, Monica, got out of the car and walked towards the front door. Dana was tall and thin with dark brown hair, and this day he wore a t-shirt and jeans. But that outfit was actually kind of unusual for him. Most of the time, when Dana went anywhere, even to his college classes, he wore a tailored Armani suit, which is very fancy. Dana looked up to his father, and he really wanted to be successful like his dad was, and so he thought it was important to dress the part. Dana and Monica walked inside the beach house, and Dana right away called out for his parents. Monica looked around the large front room and listened to the sound of the ocean just outside, and she was kind of in shock. Monica's father was an FBI agent, so she had not grown up around people who had as much money as Dana and his family. So the gold Mercedes, the beachfront property, the airplanes, and the whole lifestyle the Ewells led was just all so new to her. Dale, Glee, and Tiffany came into the front room from the kitchen and said hello to Dana and Monica. Then Glee asked Monica to go on a tour of the beach house, really just so Glee could get to know her son's new girlfriend a little bit better. And later that day, while Monica was spending time with Glee and also with Tiffany, Dana and Dale went to play tennis on a court that was reserved just for residents of this small beach community. As they played, Dale talked to his son about the airplane business, but he really wanted to hear about how Dana was doing at school. Dana said classes were going great and that he really liked his girlfriend Monica, so he was excited that the family was finally getting to meet her. Dana also said that he really hoped the entire family would get to spend more time together as a whole once this semester was over. And then the two of them started talking about their favorite topic, flying. Dana said that he wanted to get into piloting helicopters, so his dad, Dale, said they should find a good place for him to take lessons that was not too far from school. They played tennis for a bit longer, and then they headed back to the beach house. Later that night, a few hours after dinner, Dale and his wife Glee were lying in bed, and they began talking about how lucky they were to have this beach house, this really nice place where the whole family could go and spend time together and just kind of be away from everything for a little while. Glee said that she knew the kids were growing up and they had their own lives and interests, but she just hoped that Dana and Tiffany would keep coming to the beach house even when they were older and had families of their own. On April 19th, the following day, Dale helped his wife and his daughter load up Glee's gray Cadillac with the suitcases and cooler of food that they had brought to the beach. Dana and Monica were going to have Easter dinner with Monica's parents, so they had already left. Once Glee's car was loaded, Dale gave his wife and his daughter a kiss and told them he'd see them when he got home. Then Dale got into his own car and drove to the airport so he could fly his plane back to Fresno. Tiffany climbed into the passenger seat of the Cadillac, and Glee got behind the wheel, and then a couple of minutes later, they began their drive back home. It would take them 3 hours to complete the drive, but they made a pit stop about halfway through and grabbed some food at a fast food restaurant called Foster's Freeze, which was Tiffany's favorite place to get a milkshake. Finally, at about 5 p.m., Glee and Tiffany pulled into the driveway of their large ranch-style house in a secluded, wealthy neighborhood in Fresno. The house had a sprawling front yard that was beautifully landscaped with huge trees and a stone fountain in the center of the yard. Glee opened the garage door and pulled the Cadillac inside. Dale's car wasn't there, but that didn't surprise her. Even though the flight Dale had made was short, Glee knew he would spend some time at the airport making sure everything was all right with his plane. Tiffany got out of the car. She was carrying her drink from Foster's Freeze. Glee went around to the back seat, grabbed the cooler, and then followed Tiffany into their house. Once they were inside, Glee stopped to put the cooler down, but Tiffany kept on walking, and she disappeared down a hallway that led to the kitchen. Then, Glee thought that she heard something fall onto the floor down the hall, so she called out to Tiffany, but Tiffany didn't call back. So Glee walked into the hallway where Tiffany had just been, and when she did, she screamed, turned around, and started running. That night, Dana sat at the dinner table with his girlfriend Monica and her parents at Monica's parents' house. They had just finished a large Easter dinner, and Dana thanked Monica's parents for letting him spend the holiday with them. Then, not long after that, Dana and Monica drove back to their college campus in Dana's car. When they got to Dana's dorm room, he called home, but nobody answered. Dana thought it was odd that they were not picking up because he figured by now his family would be back from the beach, but Monica told him that they might have gone out for Easter dinner, or maybe they had all been worn out from the trip and just went straight to bed. But the following afternoon, Dana called home again after his classes, and there still was not any answer. So Dana called his father's office. And his father's assistant said that Dale had not checked in with her that day, but she thought it was possible that maybe Dale was just taking another day off after Easter. Dana said it seemed really strange to him that his dad had not even called the office to let her know. Dana finally hung up the phone, and then he went to find Monica in her dorm room. And as soon as Monica saw him, she knew something was wrong. Dana was pacing back and forth, and he had a really worried look on his face. Monica asked what was going on, and he told her that he still couldn't get a hold of his parents or his sister. Monica stood up and walked over to him and put her hands on his shoulders and tried to get him to calm down. And she said if he was really worried, he could totally call her dad because he was an FBI agent and he would know what to do. Dana said he really was worried, so Monica did call her father and then handed the phone over to Dana. Dana thanked Monica's dad for talking with him, and then he told him what was going on with his family. And Monica's dad pretty much immediately urged Dana to just stay calm, and then he also told Dana that, he would be happy to look around on his end to see if he could learn anything about what was going on with them. Later that day, Monica's dad would call Dana back, and even though he didn't have much information, what he did know was the Ewell's home security alarm company had not gotten any indication that the alarm had gone off or that anything out of the ordinary had occurred at the house. After hearing this, Dana did feel a bit more relaxed, and Monica would say to him that, probably he just missed his family at the house when he had called. Dana figured she was right, and he told her that he would just try to get a hold of them in the morning if they still had not contacted him by then. The next day at 9 a.m., so this was April 21st, 2 days after Glee and her daughter Tiffany had gotten back to their home in Fresno, the Ewell's housekeeper walked up to their front door, unlocked it with a key that she had, and she went inside. She was surprised that the alarm didn't beep when she walked in. The family was usually gone when she was there, and they almost always set the alarm when they left. So the housekeeper called out for Glee to see if she was home, but nobody responded. Then the housekeeper walked through the foyer into the living room that had high vaulted ceilings, and she got scared. Cushions from the couch were on the floor, and pictures had been pulled off the wall. The housekeeper called out to Glee again, but still nobody responded. And so the housekeeper took a breath and tried to calm her nerves, but when she walked into the hallway that led to the kitchen, she immediately screamed and ran back through the house out the front door, and when she got out there, she just happened to see a man walking towards her, and she began screaming out at him. The man tried to figure out what was going on. He would say that he was the Ewell's neighbor, and that their son, Dana, had called him that morning because Dana was worried about his parents. The housekeeper just shook her head, started to cry, and pointed to the Ewell's front door. The neighbor would go inside, and he would see the house was a total mess. Then he too stepped into the hallway, and immediately he ran to the phone and dialed 911. A few minutes after that 911 call, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet morning in the Ewell's wealthy Fresno neighborhood. Lead investigator John Souza of the Fresno County Sheriff's Department parked his car in front of the Ewell's house and stepped outside. It was a warm spring day, about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Souza was short with dark hair and a thick mustache, and it was bright out, so he had his sunglasses on. From behind his glasses, he could see that the police sirens had already attracted a crowd. People up and down the street were now standing on their lawns, just staring over at the Ewell's house, wondering what was going on. Detective Souza saw the Ewell's housekeeper and their neighbor, who had called 911, standing outside. The housekeeper was inconsolable, and the neighbor looked like he was still in shock. So Souza walked up to them and tried to calm them down and told them everything was okay now, and then at some point the neighbor told Souza what he had seen inside of the Ewell's house. Another squad car pulled up, and Deputy Chris Curtis got out. He was young and tall with light brown hair. Souza asked the neighbor and the housekeeper to please wait outside, and he told them that other officers would arrive soon to ask them more questions. Then Souza took off his sunglasses and waved Deputy Curtis over to him, and then the two of them walked into the Ewell's house together. Every room Souza and Curtis walked through inside of the house looked like it had been totally ransacked. Souza had spent his early days in law enforcement in the robbery unit, and he told Curtis that in all his time investigating robberies, he'd never seen a house in this state. It was like whoever had done this had opened and emptied virtually every cabinet and drawer and littered the floor with everything the Ewells owned. Then Souza and Curtis walked down the hall towards the kitchen, and they found the first body. Dale was lying face down, dead in the hallway. A pool of dried blood had formed under his face, and several unopened newspapers were scattered across the floor. Souza thought it looked like rigor mortis had already started to set in on the body. Rigor mortis is when muscles in a body stiffen after death, and so Souza wondered if Dale had been dead for days. Souza and Curtis walked further down the hall, they came to the kitchen, and they stopped again, because on the kitchen floor, they saw Tiffany lying face down like her father. Blood had run across the kitchen floor, and a drink had spilled nearby. Then they went back into the hall, walked into a home office, and found the third body. Glee was lying on her side, and massive amounts of blood had pooled behind her. Not long after Souza and Curtis found Glee, the forensics team arrived and started looking for evidence on and around the bodies. And while they did that, Souza and Curtis searched the rest of the house. The door to the main bedroom was open, and Souza could see that the bedroom looked even more torn apart than the rest of the house. He and Curtis walked into the room and saw that every drawer of a large wooden dresser had been opened, and clothes were all over the floor. Souza walked over to a vanity table and saw an open jewelry box that had been emptied. It seemed clear that whoever had killed the Ewells had also stolen valuable items from this jewelry box. So Souza thought there was a chance this was just a robbery gone wrong, that the Ewells had just come home at the worst time, and when they walked in on the robbers panicked and killed them all. After doing an initial search of the house, Souza and Curtis joined the forensics team near Dale's body. Forensics officers had found Dale's wallet nearby, but it had been cleaned out, and that supported the idea that robbery could have been the motive behind these killings. But then, forensics officers told Souza something that he was not expecting to hear. Based on the wounds on the bodies, they believed the Ewells had been shot with a semi-automatic 9mm pistol. But there was no murder weapon, and not a single bullet casing had been left behind. And they said the weapon used, and the way in which the victims were killed, was like something they had seen in professional hits carried out by drug cartels. They also told Souza that they found small yellow fibers on all three bodies, but they'd have to run tests on these fibers to know what they were. Souza didn't know what to make of any of that. On the surface, nothing about the Ewells led him to believe they were mixed up in drug smuggling or some criminal enterprise. But Souza knew enough not to rule anything out. So, as more members of his investigative team arrived, Souza sent them out to interview the Ewells' neighbors. Then, Souza got word from his boss that Dana Ewell was on his way to the sheriff's station with an FBI agent, and Souza needed to go see them. At around noon, so 3 hours after the bodies had been discovered, Dana sat with his girlfriend Monica and her father, the FBI agent, in a small office in the Fresno County Sheriff's Department. Dana had called his parents' neighbor to ask him to check on the house. After the neighbor found the bodies and called 911, he had called Dana back and told Dana he needed to come home right now. But when Dana asked what was going on, the neighbor just kept saying over and over that he just needed to come home. Right after that, Dana had found Monica, and they called Monica's dad, the FBI agent. Dana said he knew something had to be really wrong, even if the neighbor wouldn't say what it was. And so using his law enforcement contacts, Monica's dad found out what had happened, and he had called ahead to the Fresno Sheriff's Department to let them know that he and Dana would be there soon. Then Dana, Monica, and her dad had flown to Fresno and headed right to the Sheriff's Department. In the office, Monica held Dana's hand tight. Dana hadn't heard all of the details, but he knew his parents and his sister were dead. Detective Souza and Deputy Curtis walked into the office, fresh from the crime scene. Souza told Dana right away how sorry he was about what had happened. In a quiet voice, Dana asked if there was anything he could do to help. And Souza said, well, I know your father was a wealthy businessman. Do you know if maybe he had any enemies in the corporate world? Dana looked up in surprise, and then looked at his girlfriend, and then over at her father, and then he looked up at Souza and said as far as he knew, his dad did not have any enemies. They talked a while longer, and anytime Dana had questions about the investigation process, he would look to Monica's dad for help. Monica's dad and Souza both explained that it could take a while to figure out exactly what had happened. So Dana said he would stay with his uncle, who lived close by, in case the police needed anything else from him. Souza thanked them all for coming in and said he'd be in touch soon. But the following day, Dana would reach out to Souza and he would tell him that he really needed to speak to the police again. And when Souza and Dana met for the second time in that same small office at the Sheriff's Department, Dana said he had not been completely honest the day before because he did not want to upset his girlfriend or his girlfriend's father. Souza was a little thrown off by this, but he said he understood, and then he asked Dana to tell him anything that might help police in their investigation. Dana told Souza that his father, Dale, did have one enemy that he was aware of, and his name was Frank Lamb, the man who had mentored his father and who had owned the airplane business before handing it over to Dale. Detective Souza thanked Dana for coming back in and for being honest with him. And later that day, Souza discovered that Frank Lamb had not just walked away from his company in the 1970s and sold it to Dale. It turned out Frank had been busted in a federal drug trafficking case, and when he got sent to prison for 3 years, Dale had swooped in and taken the company out from under him. A few days after the murder, Souza and Curtis went to meet Frank at his house. Frank, who was very soft-spoken and polite, quickly welcomed the investigators inside. Frank said he'd read about the deaths of Dale and his family, and regardless of whatever bad blood had existed between them, Frank was sad to hear about what had happened. Souza and Curtis pressed Frank about his connection to known drug smugglers that had landed him in prison back in the 1970s. Frank said he had no connection to any drug runners and that he had nothing to do with Dale's murder. Then he smiled at Souza and said, Dale was very selfish and a very hard guy to work with, so I wouldn't be surprised if Dale had made a lot of people angry over his career. Souza and Curtis left Frank's house with not much more to go on than what they had arrived with. Souza didn't necessarily trust Frank, but the idea that Frank had waited 20 years to exact some kind of revenge on Dale didn't seem right to Souza. Still, there were details at the crime scene that made it look like the murders could have been carried out by a hitman from a drug cartel. So Souza didn't want to totally dismiss Frank as a suspect. But later that week, Souza and Curtis made a discovery that seemed even more bizarre than the idea that the Ewells were connected to a drug smuggling operation. They found out that Glee had once worked for the CIA. Souza reached out to the CIA, but the CIA was not forthcoming with many details. All Souza learned was that Glee had been a Spanish translator in South America for the CIA over 30 years earlier. So all of a sudden, Souza and his team wondered if Glee had been the target, and if the murders were somehow retribution for something she'd been involved in during her time in the agency. And that information about Glee's past somehow got out, and the media jumped all over it. Pretty soon, there were tabloid-style stories about the murdered millionaires with possible connections to international drug cartels and the CIA. With all this media attention, the spotlight got even brighter on the Fresno Sheriff's Department. And Dana and other members of the Ewell family and some friends started to publicly question if Souza and his team were really up to the task here. Dana got so frustrated with the lack of progress and the crazy rumors swirling around about his family that he publicly compared Souza and Curtis to Bert and Ernie from Sesame Street, the kids show. Dana thought these two would never find the person who had killed his parents and his sister. Souza and his team tried to block out the noise and just stay focused on their investigation. And as they continued to turn over all the evidence in front of them, they realized that despite the possible links to drug cartels and the CIA, Souza came to believe that the case might be a lot simpler than that. The Ewells were rich, and their house had been ransacked. But all the families in their neighborhood were rich too, and no other homes had been hit. So Souza wanted to focus on people who would have known how wealthy the Ewells were and who had a direct connection to them. But when Souza and his team shifted their investigation in this direction, it became clear that anyone who went to school with Dana would have known about his family's money. Because not only did Dana walk around campus in expensive Armani suits, but his college newspaper had also done a story about him. And in that story, Dana had talked a lot about the success of his father's business and his family's wealth. So Souza and his team reached out to some of Dana's friends at Santa Clara University, and a few of them said there was one person who police really needed to talk to, a recent graduate named Joel Radovich. They all said Joel was a loner and kind of a strange guy, and that he had always seemed a little obsessed with Dana. On May 8th, almost 3 weeks after the murders, Souza drove 2.5 hours from Fresno to Santa Clara to meet Joel Radovich. And when Souza had talked to Joel on the phone to arrange this meeting, he just got an odd feeling about him. Joel said he did not want police to come to his mother's house, so he would go to the motel where Souza was going to be staying. But that wasn't really what had grabbed Souza's attention. Before Souza had hung up, Joel asked him if he was going to be arrested. Souza had told Joel that, no, I really just want to talk to you, but Souza did think it was very odd that someone would jump to the conclusion that they were being arrested right off the bat. Outside the motel, Souza saw Joel pull into the parking lot in his black Honda CRX car. Joel got out of the car and began walking over to Souza. Joel was 22 years old with bleached blonde hair. He wore a baggy long-sleeve shirt and baggy jeans. Souza introduced himself and then led Joel to a small motel room, and then they both sat down at a table that was pushed up against the wall. And before Souza could even ask a question, Joel asked again if he was going to be arrested. A look of surprise came across Souza's face, and he asked why Joel was so worried about that. Joel said that he'd actually been arrested years earlier for stealing furniture from a dorm at Santa Clara University. And since then, he said the Santa Clara police were always harassing him. Souza told Joel that he didn't have anything to do with the Santa Clara police or the stolen furniture. But Souza made a note that Joel had just admitted to having committed a robbery in the past. Souza asked Joel how he knew Dana. Joel said they had met in the dorm and hung out a few times, but that was really it. Joel was a couple of years ahead of Dana in college, so they weren't really close, and Joel said he had not kept in touch with Dana, or really anybody from school, since he had graduated a year earlier. Then Souza asked Joel where he had been on Easter Sunday. Joel immediately looked up at the ceiling like he was trying to remember something, and then he looked down and he said that he'd actually been at a paint and body shop getting some work done on his car. After chatting for a bit longer, Souza finally smiled and thanked Joel for driving all this way out to the motel to meet him, and then Joel got up and walked out of the motel. But right after Joel was gone, Souza got in touch with members of his team. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he thought Joel was hiding something. He wasn't sure the kid was a killer, but he was almost positive Joel knew more than he was saying. So Souza wanted to learn as much about him as he could. It would take months for the sheriff's department to get everything in place, but eventually they got clearance to conduct full-time surveillance on Joel. And what police learned from that surveillance operation and from digging deeper into Joel's life convinced Souza the investigation was on the right track. But Souza's process was methodical and slow, and months went by without any new information getting out to the public. So Dana and other people on the outside thought the cops just weren't doing anything. And as the investigation stretched into months and then years, even Monica's dad, the FBI agent, questioned the Fresno Sheriff's Department's techniques. But Souza, Curtis, and the rest of the team just kept blocking out the public attacks. They were confident they had the killer in their sights, but they wanted to make sure their case was airtight before they moved in. In early March of 1995, almost 3 years after the murders, Souza, Curtis, and local police officers approached a TGI Fridays restaurant in a town just outside of Los Angeles. Souza went around back to where he had a car waiting, and Curtis and the others headed inside. The music was loud inside, and the place was packed, and Curtis was surprised this was where the investigation had finally led. But he and Souza were sure that the bartender working at Fridays that night was the one person who could bring the Ewell murder case to a close. Curtis weaved around a few tables and moved out of the way of the server, but he never took his eyes off the bartender. And the bartender eventually looked up and saw Curtis coming his way. The bartender immediately began scanning around the room like he was looking for his exit, but he could tell there was just no way he could make a run for it. So Curtis and the other cops walked up to the bartender and told him they needed to talk. The bartender got a look on his face like he knew he'd been caught. Then police led him out through the kitchen to a parking lot behind the restaurant, and they put him in the car where Souza was waiting for him. And when Souza was done talking to this bartender, police would finally know who had killed Dale, Glee, and Tiffany, and how they had done it. Based on information provided by the bartender, evidence found at the murder scene, and details from interviews carried out during the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened the day someone murdered the Ewell family on April 19th, 1992. On the night of April 18th, so the day before the murders, the killer watched steam rise from their shower. While the hot water ran, the killer stepped into the shower and covered their body in shaving cream. Then they reached down with their right hand, grabbed a disposable razor from the side of the shower, and ran the blade over the hair on their left forearm. A few minutes later, they rinsed the razor off under the hot water, they bent down, and started shaving the hair on their left leg. The process took a long time, but eventually the killer had removed all of their body hair except for their eyebrows and the hair on their head. After they were done, they stepped out of the shower and dried off. Before sunrise on April 19th, the following morning, the killer got dressed in all black, wore a knit hat to cover the hair on their head, and slipped on a pair of latex gloves. The killer walked outside and put a large backpack as well as an unloaded semi-automatic 9mm gun in the back seat of the car. Then the killer drove to the Ewell's neighborhood. When they arrived, they drove past the Ewell's house and parked their car a few blocks away. They grabbed the backpack and the gun, got out of the car, closed the door, and moved quickly through the darkness to the Ewell's house. Once the killer got there, they walked around to the backyard that was surrounded by a low cinder block fence. They dropped their bag and the gun into the backyard and then climbed over the fence, they grabbed their things, and then ran to a small shed in the backyard and stepped inside. The killer had studied everything about the house, and they knew there was a spare key on the floor of the shed. So they pulled a flashlight out of their bag, they found the key, they grabbed it, and then darted across the yard towards the back door. The killer unlocked the door and walked inside. The house was dark, but the killer found their way to Dale and Glee's bedroom. They turned on the light, opened their backpack, and pulled out a large plastic sheet and unrolled the sheet across the floor. Then the killer put their gun down on the plastic sheet, they walked across the room to a jewelry box, they emptied it and put the stolen jewelry in their backpack. The killer then sat down on the plastic sheet, they reached into their backpack again and pulled out ammunition as well as a homemade silencer made with PVC pipe and several tennis balls that had been cut in half. The killer loaded their gun and attached the homemade silencer to it. Then they sat there on the plastic sheet and waited patiently for someone to come home. Several hours later, at about 5 p.m., the killer heard the garage door open. The killer felt butterflies in their stomach and a jolt of nervous energy. They grabbed their gun, they ran down the hall, and crouched down in a room that was across from the kitchen. The killer could hear a door open and then also Glee and Tiffany talking. The killer tried to control their breath and told themselves to stay calm and just wait for the right moment. Then, Tiffany walked past the killer in the hall and went into the kitchen. The killer immediately sprung up from their hiding spot, walked down the hall after her, and then pointed the gun into the kitchen and fired. The bullet hit Tiffany in the back of the head. Tiffany's drink flew from her hand, blood splashed onto the walls and floor, and she fell face down. Tiffany had died almost instantly. The killer heard Glee say something from another room, so they spun around in the hall. Then Glee came around the corner and saw the killer. Glee screamed, she turned, and started to run away, but the killer fired off 3 shots in her direction, and Glee stumbled into the office nearby. The killer ran down the hall to the office and saw Glee lying on her side and bleeding. But she was still breathing, so the killer aimed and shot Glee just below the eye. The killer was breathing fast now. They walked away from Glee's body and went to hide in the room near the kitchen, where they tried to calm down and got ready to wait some more. About 30 minutes later, the killer heard the garage door open again. The sound of the door had made them tense up, and so they stood and raised their gun and got ready for the next killing. The killer heard Dale walk into the house, and then when Dale walked down that hallway right past the killer stepped out of their hiding place, raised their gun, and shot Dale in the back of the neck. Dale immediately crumpled to the floor, and newspapers he'd picked up from the front yard scattered all around him. Dale died in the hallway before ever seeing the bodies of his wife and daughter. The killer walked forward, kneeled down, and got a close look at Dale to make sure he really was dead. Satisfied, the killer grabbed Dale's wallet out of his pants pocket, slipped Dale's cash and credit cards into their own pockets, and then dropped the wallet back on the floor. Then the killer rushed through the house, emptying drawers and cabinets, knocking stuff off of tables, and trying to make the scene look like a random burglary as much as possible. Then the killer ran to the main bedroom, rolled up their plastic sheet, and put it in their backpack. Then they walked out of the house through the backyard, put the key back where they had found it in the shed, and climbed over the fence away from the property. The killer did their best to move fast through the neighborhood without drawing any attention to themselves. They made it back to their car, they hopped in, and they sped away. A few minutes later, they pulled onto the highway and left Fresno behind. When they finally made it home, they sat down in their bed and waited for the phone to ring, because they knew Dana Ewell would be in touch soon. Joel Radovich, the young man Sousa had never trusted, murdered Dale, Glee, and Tiffany. But Joel had carried these murders out at Dana Ewell's request. It would turn out that despite what Joel had told Sousa, he and Dana were close friends. In fact, some people said they were almost inseparable. And according to some of their classmates, Dana and Joel seemed to lack any sense of morality. They had convinced themselves there was no difference between right and wrong, and so any action, even murder, could be justified. And Dana wanted to murder his parents and his sister because with all of them gone, he would inherit $8 million and his father's company. Dana didn't just want to follow in his father's footsteps, he wanted to replace his father. In fact, in the story Dana's college newspaper had written about him, Dana claimed to be the brains behind his father's successful airplane business, and he even implied he was running the company while going to college. So Dana had offered Joel $4 million of the inheritance he was sure to get if Joel would kill his family. Dana had given Joel a layout of the house and said he would leave a key in the shed for him and told him how to disable the alarm system. Joel had accepted the deal. Then he bought a book called Hitman, a technical manual for independent contractors, to help him plan the perfect murders. The book had led Joel to shave off all of his body hair so he wouldn't leave any hair behind at the crime scene, which could then be used as DNA evidence. And the book suggested using a gun and a homemade silencer that could not be traced back to the shooter. But Joel needed help with that part of the plan, so he had turned to his good friend, the TGI Fridays bartender, who was an avid gun collector. The bartender had given Joel a semi-automatic 9mm, and he had helped Joel build the silencer. The tennis balls used in the silencer had left these strange yellow fibers on all the bodies. Then, after the murders, the bartender got the gun back, broke it apart, and buried the pieces in different places. And while that was all happening, Dana Ewell had called his father's office, and he had talked to his girlfriend's FBI agent father, all to throw off suspicion and to make people believe he, the son, was truly worried about his family and wanted justice for them. And Dana's tactics had worked for a little while, because it turned out that Souza was almost positive Joel Radovich had murdered the Ewells not long after they had met in the motel. But it took some serious digging before the investigators became convinced that Dana Ewell was the person behind his family's murder. And putting all the pieces together and getting an airtight case against Dana took a long time. But finally, surveillance on Joel had led police to the TGI Fridays bartender, and after they cornered him at work, the bartender told police he knew everything about the murders and he admitted his part in them. Then he led police to the place where he had buried the barrel of the gun that was used in the murders, and he agreed to testify against Joel and Dana in court. The bartender was ultimately granted immunity for his testimony, and as of 2023, he works as an attorney in California. As for Joel and Dana, they were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Dale, Glee, and Tiffany are all buried next to each other in Fresno. The epitaph on all three of their headstones reads, "Together Forever." Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are not available on this podcast. They are only on YouTube. Again, that channel is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In April of 1990, a bleary-eyed detective stepped into a townhouse in a suburb of Chicago, Illinois. The detective had been on call for days, and all he wanted to do was sleep, but now he'd been called in to investigate a double homicide. The detective opened the door to the basement and began walking down the steps. The overhead light cast shadows on the floor below, so he couldn't get a clear look at what he was walking into. But when the detective got to the bottom of the stairs, he suddenly felt wide awake. The scene in the basement was far more gruesome than he'd imagined. 2 dead bodies lay there on the floor. And there was one thing that jumped out at the detective immediately. On a cardboard box sitting between the bodies, a heart and the letter U was scrawled in blood. The detective had no idea if one of the victims had left the message, or if this was a scene staged by a deranged killer. And it would take him 6 months to get the answer he was looking for, and to discover what really happened in that basement. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please gift the follow button a homemade wind chime made out of raw hot dogs. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of April 7th, 1990, 25-year-old Nancy Langert looked at the cardboard boxes stacked up in the living room of her home in Winnetka, Illinois, trying to figure out what else she still had to pack. She and her husband Richard were moving at the end of the month, and Nancy could not wait. She was almost 3 months pregnant, and the new house had a lot more space, including a room for the baby's nursery. But as Nancy scanned the room, she realized there really wasn't much left for her to do. Other than the boxes, the only things in the room were a TV, a stereo, a card table, and some folding chairs. The truth was that even though she and Richard had been staying in this small townhouse for months that was owned actually by her parents, they had never actually really settled in. It always felt like it was a temporary place to sort their finances out, after Richard had racked up some serious gambling debt. As soon as the thought of Richard's gambling crossed her mind, Nancy shook her head and then called for her little dog, Pepsi. She heard his nails clicking across the floor, and she picked him up and scratched under his chin, trying to take her mind off of Richard's gambling and their money issues. But it was no use. It was all she could think about. Both Nancy and Richard had good jobs working at a growing coffee company, but Richard had always liked to bet on sports. And at some point, he had started spending more than he earned and began also borrowing money from friends to keep up with his gambling. It had all come to a head months earlier when Nancy and Richard fell behind on bills and had to move into this townhouse owned by Nancy's parents. And then Nancy's mother had to create a budget for them and put them on a weekly allowance, which was very embarrassing for both of them. But recently, things had gotten a lot better. They'd paid down their debt, built up their savings again, and now they were about to move out of this temporary home. In fact, at this very moment, Nancy even had $500 in cash in her purse to deposit into her bank account. Nancy gave Pepsi a kiss and put him down on the floor, and she reminded herself to stay positive. Richard was trying hard to curb his spending, and other than his gambling issue, he really was a great husband. And Richard and Nancy had both wanted a baby for so long, and now it was finally happening, and she knew Richard was going to be an amazing father. Feeling better, Nancy sat down on a folding chair and flipped on the TV. At around 6:30 p.m., the phone rang. It was Richard, telling Nancy he was leaving work, and he'd be home to pick her up in just a few minutes. They were celebrating Nancy's father's 60th birthday that night. They had an 8 p.m. dinner reservation, but they were picking up Nancy's parents and sister at her sister's place first. Nancy turned off the TV, picked up Pepsi, and took him upstairs to the bedroom so he wouldn't chew up any of the cardboard boxes while they were gone. After putting him inside, she shut the door gently, walked back downstairs, threw on a coat, and walked outside to Richard's car, shivering in the early spring chill. A few minutes later, Nancy's sister, Jean, opened the door to her apartment with a huge smile on her face. She led Nancy and Richard inside, and then she handed Nancy 2 beautifully wrapped presents that she'd brought back from a recent trip to Ireland. Nancy opened up the first gift and found a gorgeous Irish wool sweater inside. But the other present made Nancy feel like she might cry from happiness. It was a little onesie and booties for a newborn baby. Nancy thanked Jean repeatedly and gave her a big hug. She was so happy. At around 8 p.m., the group got to the restaurant, and Nancy was happily surprised to see that none of her parents' friends were meeting them there. The celebration would now just be with family. It wasn't that Nancy didn't like her parents' friends, though. Some of them had been around for so long that they actually felt like her own family. Like her dad's work friend, Nick Biro, and his wife Joan, who she had totally expected to be there. But then there was this guy, Victor, who was one of her father's closest friends, but he was also rumored to be in the mob. Nancy didn't mind Victor, but Richard could not stand him. So his absence from the party was a relief. As the food started to arrive to their table, Nancy suddenly didn't feel well. Her pregnancy was giving her really bad nausea, and the smell of pasta and steak just set it off. But she didn't want to ruin the night for everyone, so she tried to hide the fact that she really just wanted to go throw up. However, she could see her mom looking over at her with a raised eyebrow from across the table, and Nancy forced a smile back. She knew she was not convincing her mother that she was doing okay, but her mother just went back to her lasagna without saying anything, in fear she might embarrass her daughter. After dinner, Nancy and the rest of her family all piled back into Richard's car so he could drive everybody home. He dropped Nancy's sister Jean off first, and when she got out, Jean gave Nancy a big hug and told her she would see her tomorrow at church. Then Richard dropped off Nancy's parents. However, Nancy's mother paused before getting out of the car. She said she noticed at dinner that Nancy was feeling sick and asked if maybe Nancy and Richard wanted to spend the night there, at her house. For a second, Nancy did consider it. I mean, having your parents around if you're feeling sick is kind of like what everybody wants. But Richard was supposed to dog sit for a neighbor, and she wanted to sleep in her own bed, cuddled up with Pepsi, so she ultimately said, no thank you. Her parents then said goodnight, and then they walked into their house. On the drive back home, Richard and Nancy planned out the rest of their evening. Richard would walk the neighbor's dog, and then actually sleep over at the neighbor's house to keep the dog company. But first, Nancy and Richard would take their dog, Pepsi, for a walk together. They pulled up to their townhouse, and Richard walked around the car, opened up Nancy's door, and helped her outside. They smiled at each other, and he asked her how she was feeling, and Nancy said she still felt nauseous, but she was too happy about everything to let it bother her. Richard gave Nancy's shoulder a quick squeeze, and then they walked inside together. At 7 a.m. the next morning, Nancy's mother called her daughter to see if she was feeling any better. But Nancy didn't pick up, so her mom figured she must be sleeping in and hung up without leaving a message. She knew she would just see her daughter later at church anyway. However, when Nancy's mother got to church that day and took her seat in their regular pew, the bench beside her stayed empty for the entire service. Nancy's mom worried the entire time, so as soon as she got back home, she called her daughter again. And when Nancy still didn't answer, Nancy's father said he was going over to the townhouse to make sure everything was okay. Nancy's dad got to the townhouse just a few minutes later. He figured Nancy was just sick and sleeping, so he wasn't actually all that worried. He rang the bell, but nobody answered, so he took out his own key, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The place felt oddly quiet, and no one responded when he called out. Then Nancy's dad saw his daughter's purse lying on the floor, surrounded by cash and credit cards, and so now he was worried. Suddenly, he heard a noise upstairs. It sounded like scratching on a door. So he ran out of the room, took the steps up 2 at a time, and then headed down the second-floor hallway to Nancy's bedroom, where the scratching sound was coming from. There, he opened up the door, and the little dog Pepsi came running out, and the stench of urine immediately hit Nancy's dad. Now he was really starting to panic. He knew his daughter would never lock her precious dog in a room long enough for the dog to have to urinate all over the ground. He turned and ran back downstairs, now screaming his daughter's name, but still he didn't get an answer. He knew there was only one place he hadn't checked yet, the basement. Nancy's father ran to the top of the basement stairs. The basement light was on, but all he could see when he looked downstairs were shadowy shapes below, which he assumed must be their moving boxes. But as he slowly walked down the stairs and the shapes came into view, he gasped. They weren't boxes. They were the bodies of his pregnant daughter and his son-in-law. They were both covered in blood. Nancy was still wearing her clothes from the night before, and her eyes were wide open. For a moment, Nancy's father simply froze, unable to process what he was seeing. Then he leapt down the remaining stairs to his daughter's side and grabbed her hand, but it was freezing cold. He sprinted back up the stairs and he dialed 911. Winnetka Police Sergeant Gene Calvados woke up to the sound of his wife's voice calling him from the other room. He blinked at his clock, which read 6:40 p.m. He'd worked overnight and hadn't gotten to bed until about midday, and now his wife was saying he had yet another phone call from headquarters. All Sergeant Calvados wanted was just to go back to sleep, but he forced himself to get up and go to the phone because this was his job. And as soon as he heard his lieutenant's voice in the phone, Calvados snapped wide awake. The lieutenant said there had been a double homicide, and Calvados needed to get to the scene right now. A few minutes later, Sergeant Calvados parked his car outside of Nancy and Richard's townhouse. Calvados had seen plenty of violent deaths in his life. Before he became a police officer, he had served in Vietnam, and he had watched other young men in his unit grow hardened to bloodshed and violence, but Calvados really never got used to it. In fact, Calvados could see the face of every dead person he'd ever seen as clearly as if they were still right in front of him. And now he braced himself for the faces he was about to see in that basement. Sergeant Calvados stepped out of his car, and he saw several officers speaking to Nancy's father outside the house. Calvados quickly introduced himself, and then headed inside, where a forensics team was already combing through the townhouse. One of the forensics officers came over to Calvados. He said the double homicide had taken place in the basement, but before Calvados went downstairs, he wanted to show the detective 3 pieces of evidence they'd found on the first floor. The forensics officer pointed to the ground just a few feet away, and Calvados noticed Nancy's purse lying there with $500 in cash and several credit cards lying next to it. Calvados quickly noticed there was still a TV and a high-end stereo in the room, so it seemed unlikely that what they were dealing with here was a robbery gone bad. Then the forensics officer led Calvados towards a door that opened onto a small back patio. Calvados saw a perfectly cut square piece of glass, which had been removed from the door and placed on the floor inside. And the forensics officer pointed out something interesting. The door was still locked. So whoever cut the glass did not reach through the hole and unlock the door, which would have been easy. Instead, they literally climbed through the small hole in the door, which would have taken far more time and effort. Finally, the forensics officer took Calvados over to a small card table that was next to a moving box. The officer said it looked like someone had rifled through the box and put a single item from it on the table. Calvados leaned in, and a look of surprise came across his face. The item on the table was Nancy and Richard's marriage license. But the forensics officer said he didn't know yet if the person who broke in had put the license there or if maybe it just happened to be there already. Calvados thanked the officer, and then after taking a deep breath, he headed to the basement, hoping things would start to get a bit clearer down there. Calvados walked down the steps slowly, and as the scene came into view, he couldn't help but wince. Richard had been handcuffed and shot in the back of the head. It looked like he had probably died instantly. Nancy, though, was not handcuffed, and her death had clearly been slow. She was shot twice in her side and in her abdomen, and there was blood smeared all around her body, like she had crawled or rolled in the blood after being wounded, and her eyes were still open, frozen in her final moment. Calvados also saw an axe on the floor between Richard and Nancy, and he wondered how that figured into the crime if the killer had a gun. Had the couple tried to fight back with it? He didn't know. Then something else caught Sergeant Calvados' attention. On a moving box between the bodies, a small heart and the letter U were scrawled in blood. Calvados crouched down and saw blood on one of Nancy's fingertips, so he wondered if she had left this message or if the killer had staged it to look that way. Regardless of the answer, Calvados realized whoever killed Nancy and Richard had not acted in the heat of the moment. The handcuffs and the execution-style shooting of Richard proved that. And that execution-style shooting made Calvados wonder if the murders had been carried out by a professional hitman. The cut glass in the patio door could also support that theory because it suggested a very high level of planning. But Calvados stood there and just shook his head, like he was arguing with himself. Removing the glass in the door seemed like something a professional would do, but then why would the professional killer squeeze through the small hole in the door instead of just reaching in and unlocking the door? Also, Richard's murder seemed like a cold-blooded, very efficient assassination, whereas Nancy's murder seemed sloppy. She clearly lived long enough to roll or crawl through the blood on the floor, and she might have lived long enough to even write that message on the moving box. So in a way, Calvados felt like he was almost looking at two different crime scenes at once. One crime scene for Richard and one crime scene for Nancy. Calvados suddenly felt a tap on his shoulder. It was one of the officers who'd been talking to Nancy's dad. The officer told Calvados he had very important information. Nancy had been pregnant. Calvados' heart sank. He knew the look on Nancy's face would stay with him for a very long time. Later that day, as officers met with Nancy and Richard's neighbors, the chief of police decided to form a task force to investigate the double murder. He said he would ask for help from detectives from surrounding suburbs, but he wanted Sergeant Calvados to lead the team. Calvados knew this was going to be the biggest challenge of his career. A double homicide of a young couple that was potentially carried out by a professional hitman was a whole different level of crime than he'd ever seen in Winnetka. The next day, Sergeant Calvados knocked on the door of Nancy's parents' house. Nancy's dad opened the door, and Calvados could tell from his puffy eyes that he'd been crying. As gently as he could, Calvados asked the father if he could get Nancy and Richard's wedding albums and address books, or anything that could help him identify all of their friends and acquaintances. Nancy's father just nodded, looking shell-shocked, and invited the sergeant to come inside while he looked. Calvados stepped inside and then sat down on the couch, and Nancy's mother came in. She also had a vacant stare on her face, almost like she literally couldn't process what had happened. Still, almost on autopilot, she politely offered him some coffee, which Calvados said no thank you to. Then, Calvados told her that he was the one leading this investigation, and he really needed her to think as hard as she could about all the people in her daughter's life. Did she know anyone who might want to hurt Nancy or Richard? But Nancy's mother shook her head and said no. And as Nancy's father came in with the things the sergeant had asked for, he also said the same thing. Nancy and Richard were wonderful people with a big supportive group of friends. The idea that either of them had enemies seemed kind of ridiculous. On Tuesday, April 10th, so 3 days after the murders, Nancy and Richard's bosses at the coffee company offered a $10,000 reward for information in the case, and also Nancy's parents matched it. And so tips about Nancy and Richard began to pour in. Phones at police headquarters rang constantly, and before long, the task force was totally inundated. And as Sergeant Calvados sifted through all this new information they were getting, a new and much more complicated picture of the murdered couple began to emerge. A few tipsters alerted the sergeant to Richard's gambling debts, and the fact that he very likely owed people money because of his gambling problem. This was a major red flag to Calvados, but the debts themselves actually seemed way too small to be worth killing two people over. However, the tips about Nancy were more promising. Apparently, she had had an affair for more than a year, and her former lover had left town for Georgia just 2 days after the murders. This, combined with the marriage contract left on the table at the crime scene, made Calvados wonder if the killings were retaliation from Nancy's ex-lover for breaking the affair off. Calvados sent detectives down to Georgia to speak with Nancy's former lover, but the man said the affair was far more emotional than physical. Nancy mostly just wanted someone to talk to because Richard was working 2 jobs and she was just kind of lonely. But when Richard got his full-time job at the coffee company, the couple had totally reconciled and they got back to normal. And so this ex-lover said at that point, he also had been ready to move on. And so even though the move to Georgia came so close to the murders, it had actually been planned out for weeks. Calvados wasn't quite prepared to rule this man out quite yet, but he was already finding this case very frustrating. Everything from the conflicting evidence at the crime scene where, one murder is well planned and the other seems sloppy, and, the glass, why did you climb through and not unlock it by reaching through, to the contradictory stories about the victims, seemed to pull him in very different directions. Meanwhile, rumors of hitmen and criminal syndicates began flying all over town. There was a bike path that ran behind Nancy and Richard's house, leading basically all the way to Chicago, and residents became convinced that a Chicago mobster must have been the killer, and they must have used that path to travel in and out sight unseen. Calvados did not necessarily buy that, but he got a tip that a close friend of Nancy's father, a man named Victor, supposedly had ties to the mafia. So Calvados began digging. However, he struggled to find anything useful. At least on the surface, Victor looked like an upstanding businessman. So Calvados was not any closer to nailing down a primary suspect. Four days after the murders, a massive crowd of 800 people from the area gathered for Nancy and Richard's funeral. I mean, the community really came out in force, to the point where random local groups like the high school's Peace Alliance Club and the track team were waiting in these long lines after the service just to offer their condolences to Nancy and Richard's family. I mean, their deaths really took a toll on this town. Sergeant Calvados and some other detectives also went to the funeral, but mostly just to look for anybody who seemed nervous or excited or maybe overly dramatic. But all they found was a large group of people trying desperately to understand how something this horrible could have happened. After the funeral, Calvados went back to the station. He was on his way to his office when a lieutenant stopped him to tell him that somebody was there to see him. The lieutenant took Calvados to a very nervous-looking couple who said they had a tip about Nancy's sister, Jean. Jean was a lawyer, and she was heavily involved in political issues in Ireland. At that time, Ireland was in the midst of a violent period known as the Troubles. The Troubles were clashes between Protestants and Catholics over control of Northern Ireland, and there were regular shootings, car bombings, murders, and kidnappings. And Jean was not neutral. She provided legal aid to members of the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, which was the Catholic organization blamed for many acts of violence. The couple also told Sergeant Calvados that Jean had received a threat that if she returned to Ireland, she would be injured or maybe even killed. But despite that threat, Jean had gone back to Ireland very recently, and when she had arrived home, she showed up with gifts for Nancy and the baby just 3 days before the murders. The sergeant listened quietly, but inside, he was practically jumping out of his skin. This was the best lead he'd gotten so far. Maybe, he thought, somebody was hired to kill Jean, but killed Nancy and her husband by mistake. Or maybe they killed Nancy on purpose just to hurt Jean. It was not unheard of during the Troubles for innocent family members to be targeted for political revenge. And so, after speaking to this couple, Calvados got on the phone and called Jean into the station. Later that day, Calvados sat down across a table in a small interview room with Jean, and he could tell right away she was completely unlike any suspect he'd ever questioned before. Jean was unusually confident for somebody who was about to be questioned by a homicide detective. She sat up perfectly straight and calmly looked Calvados right in the eyes, without fidgeting or tapping her fingers or shifting around in her seat. Calvados asked Jean some basic questions about her job, and she was quite helpful. But then, the sergeant mentioned the threat that had been made on her life because of her work in Ireland, and also this theory that maybe a hired killer took out Nancy either by mistake or for revenge. At this point, Jean's demeanor totally changed. She went from cool and collected to sharp and visibly angry. She said it was ridiculous to imagine a gunman could confuse Nancy for her. They looked nothing alike. And the idea that someone would kill Nancy to get back at Jean was even more outrageous. Jean insisted that her job in Ireland was mostly human rights work, and not worth killing her over, let alone her sister. Jean leaned forward and looked Calvados dead in the eyes and told him he was really stretching with that theory. Calvados was genuinely surprised. This was not what he was expecting, and he wasn't sure if Jean's reaction was fueled by righteous indignation at questions she truly considered unfair, or anxiety and guilt at the idea that she might have played a role in putting her sister at risk. But the sergeant pressed on, and he asked Jean for the names of every person she had visited the last time she was in Ireland, along with all of her work associates there. Jean turned red and yelled at the sergeant that none of this had anything to do with her sister's murder. She said Calvados was not getting anything from her, and then she stood up and stormed out of the interview room. Sergeant Calvados just sat there, both really surprised and really mad. This death threat on Jean was the first real lead they had, and he couldn't fully investigate it without the names from Jean. He had expected her to be grateful and to immediately offer up anything she knew to try to figure out who killed her sister. And so he just couldn't believe Jean was unwilling to help him, unless, of course, she was involved. Without any information from Jean about the death threat, Calvados was left chasing other possibilities that frankly just seemed increasingly unlikely. Both Richard and Nancy had worked for a coffee company that imported their beans from Colombia, which Calvados and basically everybody knew was a major importer of cocaine. He knew that drug cartels sometimes hid cocaine in coffee shipments. In fact, just 3 months before the murders, federal agents had seized 5 kilograms of cocaine in a coffee shipment from a different coffee company. So Calvados started poking around into the coffee company, looking for any ties to cartels. But the owners of the company seemed mostly puzzled by this, and they gave Calvados permission to inspect their next shipment, like they didn't care at all, look at whatever you want. And so Calvados did that, flagging the ship that had their coffee on it to U.S. Customs officers, who then met the vessel when it came into port. A giant crane lifted the container with their coffee out of the ship and onto the dock, and then Customs officer cracked it open. Then they began slicing through random bags of beans to see if their drug-sniffing German shepherds could pick up a scent. But, like Calvados had feared, they found nothing. The police began to feel like they were just grasping at straws, and so they decided they should just go back to the beginning and kind of start over. So they re-interviewed all the neighbors, and they got one tantalizing tip about a mysterious man walking around the neighborhood the night of the murders, but after looking into it, they discovered it was actually just a bored teenager who lived nearby. After that, they looked into whether Richard and Nancy had maybe taken a loan from mobsters to lease their new place, but when they looked at the couple's tax records, they saw they could easily afford the rent. And so, once again, one after another, all the tips and leads they were finding just went nowhere. Calvados still had suspicions that Jean's ties to the IRA got her sister killed, but without Jean's cooperation, he struggled to make any headway on that lead. So by the end of May, Sergeant Calvados was basically out of ideas as his big case rapidly went cold. Finally, on May 30th, so about a month after the murders, the police chief pulled Calvados into his office. From the look on Chief's face, Calvados knew the news was not good, but he could not have guessed what was coming next. The chief told him they were going to dismantle the task force. They had spent a whopping $1 million on this investigation so far and still had not come up with a serious single suspect. Calvados was shocked. This felt way too early to basically give up. But the chief wasn't done. In addition to dismantling the task force, he wanted Calvados back on the beat while another investigator stepped in and took a look at this case. The chief followed up and told Calvados that he was not taking him off the case completely, he just wanted a set of fresh eyes on it. But as Calvados nodded and turned to walk out of the office, it definitely felt like he had failed, and he was being removed. Sergeant Calvados walked slowly towards his team to break the bad news, at the same time feeling totally sick and angry at the thought of patrolling the neighborhood again, with everything in this case still completely up in the air. But a few days later, sure enough, Calvados was back in his blue uniform, driving a police cruiser around Winnetka. He figured his days as a detective were likely over. 6 months passed with no progress at all in the Langert case. Sergeant Calvados focused on working his beat, but at the same time, he just felt so distracted because all he felt was regret that he had not been able to find the killer. But then, on October 4th, Sergeant Calvados was home sleeping when his wife woke him up telling him that work was calling, just like she had done on the day of the murder. But this time, when he picked the phone up, his lieutenant was yelling excitedly that there had been a break in Nancy and Richard's case, and Calvados had to get down to the station right now. Calvados was so excited, he rushed out of bed, he jumped into his car, and he sped to the station, but when he got there, he found the supposed break was just a kid, and not a very tough-looking kid either. It was a skinny high school senior who had arrived at the station with his girlfriend for moral support, asking about the witness protection program. Calvados had to keep himself from rolling his eyes. He wondered what this kid could possibly know about a brutal double homicide. And at first, when the kid began talking, his story, predictably, sounded unbelievable. The kid said he somehow knew the killer, and the killer had supposedly confessed everything to him in unbelievable detail. But as he began walking Calvados and the other detectives through what he knew, Calvados realized this kid was telling the truth. The teenager knew details of the crime that had never been made public, like how many shots were fired and the fact that the marriage contract was on the table. But beyond individual details, the teenager's story explained all the strange contradictions that Calvados had struggled with since the beginning of the case. Richard was killed quickly and efficiently, but Nancy's murder was messy and slow. The killer had apparently brought a gun along, but someone had grabbed an axe that wasn't entirely clear, and then the killer had used glass-cutting tools to get inside, but then needlessly crawled through the tiny hole in the door instead of just reaching through and unlocking it. And so all these things definitely lined up with what Calvados had suspected. Calvados had never been able to figure out if the killer was a professional hitman or a sloppy amateur, but now, as the sergeant listened to this kid talk, it seemed like the killer might have been a little bit of both. After speaking to this kid and looking at all the evidence in the case and looking at all their interviews, here is a reconstruction of what police think happened on the night of Saturday, April 7th, 1990, when Nancy and Richard were murdered inside of their home. The killer arrived at Nancy and Richard's townhouse while the couple was out to dinner. The killer had been preparing for this moment for months. They approached the patio door from the path that ran behind the house. They didn't even bother trying the doorknob. Instead, they pulled out a glass cutter to remove a section of the sliding patio doors. And then once the cuts were made, they stuck some very sticky tape to the front of the glass piece and then pulled it out silently, just like they had been practicing. Then, once it was out, instead of reaching through and opening the door, the killer crawled into the house through the hole and then waited. But they had no idea how long it would be before Nancy and Richard came home, and as the minutes turned to hours, the killer began to get restless. And so they just started wandering around the house sort of aimlessly, rifling through random boxes that were sitting around. And it was there that the killer found Nancy and Richard's marriage contract. They began to read it, but it was mostly legal jargon, so they just placed it on the card table near the box they dug it out of. But the longer the killer waited for Nancy and Richard to come home, the more impatient they got, and the more nervous. And so they ultimately just turned on a light and then sat on a chair in the shadows with their gun on their lap. They had a hood pulled down low, but they thought the light shining from behind them would help hide their face even more. Then finally, sometime after 11 p.m., the killer heard voices and then the key in the door. Nancy and Richard walked inside, but they were so caught up in their conversation, they didn't even notice the killer sitting there. But then the killer spoke and told them to be quiet and closed the door behind them. The killer could instantly see how startled Nancy and Richard were. The killer then raised their gun, and Nancy and Richard's surprise quickly turned to fear. The killer loved it. The killer demanded Nancy hand over her purse. She said she didn't have any money, but the killer demanded the purse again, and so Nancy threw it to the killer, and everything inside of it fell out onto the floor, including the stack of cash totaling $500. Nancy started stammering that she'd forgotten about the money, and Richard urged the killer to just please take the cash and go. She wasn't trying to lie to you. But the killer, who acted totally offended at the idea that they were hiding things from him, was not actually here for their money. They didn't care. The killer, still aiming their gun at Nancy and Richard, reached into their pocket to pull out handcuffs. But as they fished around in their pocket, they began to curse. In their excitement about this night, they'd only brought one pair of handcuffs, not the two they actually needed. But Richard was clearly the bigger threat. He was a tall, athletic guy, so the killer gave the cuffs to Nancy and told her to handcuff her husband. As Nancy handcuffed Richard's hands behind his back, she began to plead with the killer. "Please don't hurt us. I'm pregnant." Something about Nancy's plea hit the killer hard, and they could feel their hands begin to shake. Suddenly there was a noise upstairs, and the killer accidentally pulled the trigger, shooting a bullet into the baseboards. But the killer quickly realized that the noise was just the dog, closed in the upstairs bedroom, barking at something. Still, the killer felt like their plan was now quickly falling apart. Things were already going so wrong. The killer started to lose their nerve, and they thought about sparing Nancy and Richard. So the killer told the couple to go to the basement, and then once they were down there, the killer would lock the door and just leave. And so the killer directed Nancy and Richard to the basement stairs at gunpoint, and no one said a word. But as Nancy and Richard descended the stairs and then reached the bottom of the stairs, Nancy suddenly turned around and looked at the killer. And the killer knew from her surprised look on her face that she had seen the killer's face. The light was better down there, and the hood did not disguise the killer enough. The killer knew Nancy would be able to identify them. And so now the killer had a choice to make. Let them live and face the consequences, or follow through with the plan. But before the killer could decide, Richard made a desperate move. With all his strength, he snapped the cheap handcuffs, jumped at the killer, and smashed his own head against the killer's head. Almost instinctively, the killer just fired the gun, and it hit Richard right in the back of his head. Richard crumpled to the floor. Nancy rushed to his side, screaming, then looked back at the killer, whose gun was still raised. Nancy shouted, "Not again, no!" and covered her face as the killer took a shot at her. The killer turned and ran up the stairs, but as they got to the top, they looked back. Nancy was still alive and moving. The bullet had only hit her in the elbow. The killer knew at this point they had already come this far, they had to go back. So the killer raised their gun again and pulled the trigger one more time. The bullet hit Nancy and lodged in her pregnant stomach. She collapsed to the floor, and the killer turned and ran out of the basement. But after the killer left, Nancy was still alive. Barely. She tried to climb up the stairs, but it was a struggle. The coat she was wearing was quickly filling with blood, weighing her down. And so with an enormous effort, she managed to pull off her jacket, but as she looked up the stairs, she knew it was just too much. She would never get up there. So, Nancy turned and dragged herself over to the basement shelves and grabbed the nearest thing she could reach, the axe. And then with the axe, she banged on the shelf, hoping that the noise would get somebody's attention, but nobody came to the rescue. And so with her last bit of strength, Nancy dropped the axe, dipped her finger in her own blood, dragged herself over to a moving box on the floor, and drew a heart and the letter U. She looked at Richard, hoping maybe there was a small chance he would live and see her final message. I love you. And then Nancy took her final breath. When the police began investigating this case, they knew that some of the evidence suggested the killer was an amateur, but most of their leads pointed to a professional hitman, which is why Calvados and his team had been so interested in the mob and in drugs and the IRA. It was a mistake that allowed one person to escape any attention at all, because the killer was right there, hanging around the investigation in plain sight the entire time. He was one of the members of the High School Peace Alliance Club who came to the funeral. He was on the track team too, so he ran past the Langert's house almost every single day. The police had even questioned him, because he was also the teenage boy who had been seen in the neighborhood on the night of the murders but had quickly been written off. But it turned out that kid, the 16-year-old named David Biro, was the killer. And he also happened to be the son of Nancy's family friends, Nick and Joan Biro, who Nancy had thought might be at her father's birthday party on the night that she was killed. It would turn out 16-year-old David had serious psychological issues, and he had become obsessed with becoming a hitman after seeing the 1980s movie, Bestseller, about a hitman who wanted to turn his story into a book. The idea of killing people excited David, and he had actually already tried to do it at least once before. Prior to the murders, David's parents had him committed to a psychiatric hospital after he tried to poison his own family. But after only 2 months, his parents had let him come home against the recommendation of his doctors. And once he was home, teenager David Biro chose to live out his hitman fantasy by killing Nancy and Richard. And his reason for targeting Nancy and Richard had nothing to do with their connections to his family. Instead, he chose them as his murder victims because their townhouse was conveniently located, and he also found them, quote, annoying. David might have gotten away with these murders, but as the months went by and the police never came for him, he got cocky, and he began to brag to a friend about what he had done. He even showed his friend the glass that he'd practiced his glass cutting on, and he also showed him the murder weapon. And David's friend pretty much immediately turned him in, because he was very worried David would kill again. And so, on October 5th, 1990, almost 6 months to the day after Nancy and Richard were gunned down, David was arrested. It was the day before Nancy's baby would have been due. David was sentenced to life in prison for killing Nancy, Richard, and their unborn child. Nancy's parents would move back into Nancy and Richard's townhouse shortly after the murders as a way to feel closer to Nancy and Richard. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On a hot summer night in Arizona, a man was sleeping soundly in a second-floor bedroom with his beloved dog curled up at his feet. But suddenly, the dog heard something outside on the roof. And then the bedroom window shattered, sending glass flying into the room. But no matter how much the dog barked, his owner didn't move. The horrible thing that happened inside of that bedroom would give a rookie detective her first major case. A case with a series of twists and turns that seemed to come right out of a soap opera. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, after a long night of watching horror movies with the Amazon Music follow button, tell them you're going home, but secretly hide in their bushes outside, and then right around 3 a.m., begin scratching and tapping on all of their windows. Okay, let's get into today's story. On a July morning in 2016, 45-year-old Nick Morales sped down a desert road in Marana, Arizona, just outside of Tucson. Nick saw the mountains in the distance as he drove past several large airplane hangars and a massive 7,000-foot runway. Then Nick slowed down, turned off the road near a white concrete office building, and pulled into the parking lot of Marana Aerospace Solutions. Marana Aerospace Solutions was a company that handled aircraft maintenance for major commercial airlines and aircraft manufacturers like Boeing and Airbus. And Nick was the company's director of maintenance, a job that came with a ton of responsibility and a whole bunch of people that worked underneath him. Nick stepped out of his car. He was tall with brown eyes, he had a short military-style haircut, and a goatee that was just starting to turn gray. He walked through the parking lot toward the office building, and it felt like most July mornings in that part of Arizona. It was already 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and Nick knew that even by midday, it would be at least 10 degrees hotter. But Nick didn't mind the heat. Before getting into the aerospace industry, he had been a decorated United States Marine and had served in Kuwait, a very hot place in the Middle East, during the First Gulf War. After that experience, working on airplanes in the Arizona desert felt comfortable by comparison. Nick stepped inside the building, and right away he felt the cold blast from the air conditioner. He said good morning to a few coworkers, and then he walked to his office, sat down, checked his email, and began going over his schedule for the day. Nick wanted to head outside to one of the airplane hangars so he could check on the progress of a particular job, but his office phone rang. And so Nick answered, and he heard the director of human resources on the other line. And the HR director asked if Nick wouldn't mind coming to his office so they could chat. Nick hung up, and he felt really annoyed. He didn't know what the director wanted, but he knew from experience that getting called into HR was rarely a good thing. Nick walked out and headed down a long hallway to the HR director's office. The door was already open, and the director waved Nick inside. Nick closed the door behind him and took a seat. The HR director was a nice guy, and he and Nick got along fine, but Nick really just wanted this meeting to end quickly, so he asked point blank, "What's going on?" And the HR director said, one of Nick's employees had recently filed a complaint against him. Now, Nick knew the HR director was not going to tell him who actually filed this complaint, but Nick wanted to know what the complaint actually was. And the director told him that the employee basically complained that Nick was way too hard on his team all the time. Nick shook his head. Complaints like that made no sense to him. If somebody was not doing their job the right way, Nick just told them. He wasn't trying to be mean, he was just trying to be efficient. A lot of his team members figured that Nick's straightforward and often harsh management style just stemmed from his military background. But that actually was not the reason. Nick knew working on aircrafts affected the lives and safety of other people, and so he saw no room for error. So if somebody did their job poorly, he had to make sure they knew about it. The HR director understood where Nick was coming from, and he wasn't planning on taking any immediate action against Nick or anything. He just wanted Nick to know what was going on. Nick left the office and walked outside into the hot Arizona sun. As he paced around for a second, he thought about the HR complaint more and more, and the more he thought about it, the more annoyed he got, because he was actually pretty sure he knew who made the complaint. James LePan, a safety inspector on Nick's team, had recently clashed with Nick at work. Nick had caught James parking in a restricted area, and he let him have it. Then Nick saw James spending time on his personal tablet during work hours, and again, he let him have it. While Nick felt like what he did was justified, he knew there was a pretty good chance James did not feel the same way. Eventually, Nick began walking towards an airplane hangar that was off in the distance. He could have driven over, but he figured, walking would help him clear his head. As he walked, Nick couldn't help but think about maybe confronting James about this whole complaint, but he knew, that would be a mistake. He didn't even know for sure if James really was the guy who made the complaint. And Nick knew he really could not afford to keep drawing the attention of HR. Nick had had run-ins with the HR department before, but those run-ins had nothing to do with his actual work. Nick had been described by many as a ladies' man, and he had lived up to that description during his time at Marana Aerospace. He had dated at least 3 women he had worked with, and there was a pretty good chance there were more women at work, but Nick wouldn't admit to them. And 2 of those 3 relationships that he admitted to ended really badly. Over a year earlier, Nick had been dating a colleague, a woman named Jessica, and she had started spending a lot of her time at Nick's house. But one evening, she had caught Nick in bed with another woman they worked with named Claudia. Jessica was furious and she lashed out at Nick, and Nick basically told her, okay, fine, the relationship's over and you need to leave. And so soon after that, Jessica left and Claudia began spending most of her time at Nick's place. But that relationship also fell apart when Nick started seeing yet another colleague named Christina. And when Nick and Christina had recently gotten engaged, it did not go over well with his ex-girlfriends. And so the whole thing had played out like a soap opera at work, and even though the company did not have a policy against office relationships, Nick's actions and his ex-girlfriend's anger had previously landed him in the HR director's office. Nick walked into the airplane hangar and saw members of his team hard at work. The sights and sounds of the hangar immediately put Nick at ease, and he pushed aside any thoughts about his personal affairs. Even employees who didn't necessarily love the way Nick managed them knew Nick took his job really seriously, and he worked harder than anyone. So Nick spent the rest of the day checking in on different maintenance projects and stepping in to help whenever his team needed him. By the time he was heading home that evening, the sun was starting to set, and it was painting the desert orange and pink. And something happened on the drive home, like it did most nights when Nick left work. He suddenly changed into this totally different person. The hard-nosed, confrontational boss suddenly became a soft-spoken guy who loved his dog and tending to plants in his garden. Nick drove down the street of his secluded suburban neighborhood and pulled into the garage of his 2-story house. He walked inside and heard his beloved pit bull terrier, Smokey, barking and running to greet him. Nick crouched down and pet Smokey and talked to the dog like he was a baby. Then he told Smokey it was time to go for a walk, and the dog got even more excited. Nick and Smokey headed outside just as the last rays of the sun disappeared for the night. After he and Smokey had been walking for a while, Nick felt his phone vibrate inside of his pocket. He grabbed it and looked at a text message and smiled. Then he told Smokey they needed to pick up the pace because Nick's fiancée, Christina, was heading over to the house and he couldn't wait to see her. On July 17th, 2016, so about a week after Nick dealt with that HR complaint, he spent a lazy Sunday with his fiancée, Christina, at her house. Nick had been married twice, and after his second divorce, he had sworn to his friends and family that he would never get married again. But soon after Nick and Christina had met at work, Nick began to change his mind. He thought Christina was beautiful, and that she was one of the most positive, considerate people he had ever met. Christina knew about Nick's past with other women at work, but after spending time with him, she stopped worrying about it. She loved Nick and wanted to be with him. So when Nick had asked her to marry him, she immediately said yes. And so that Sunday, Nick and Christina laid around Christina's house and discussed potential wedding venues and other wedding details. But then Nick brought up the recent HR complaint. For some reason, even a week later now, it was still bothering him. Christina knew Nick well enough that she knew he was not about to change his management style. She just wished his employees could see that Nick actually was very different than the persona they saw at work. At home, he was a funny, caring, loving guy. It was just the way he had to be at work. That's why he acted that way. Ultimately, Christina told Nick, "Don't worry about it. It'll be fine. It's just work stuff. It'll go away. Don't stress." The couple chatted for a bit longer. Then around 6 p.m., Nick got up and he gave Christina a kiss, and then he headed back to his house. Christina had some things to deal with at her own place, so she was going to stay there for the night. Once Nick got home, he took Smokey out for a walk and then relaxed and watched some TV. Later that night, he called Christina and they talked some more. On nights they didn't stay together, they always made sure to talk on the phone before bed, and then they would always text each other first thing in the morning. Nick told Christina he loved her and then said goodnight. He went upstairs to his bedroom and Smokey followed. Nick took off all his clothes, he often slept naked when it was this hot out, and he climbed into bed. Smokey leapt up onto the bed too and curled up by Nick's feet. and pretty soon they were both fast asleep. But several hours later, at around 4 a.m., so the next morning, Smokey suddenly woke up when he heard a sound coming from outside the window on the roof. A few hours later, at around 8:30 a.m., Christina listened to Nick's voicemail for the third or fourth time, and she had no idea what was going on. Nick woke up early every day, and he usually headed out to work by 6 a.m. So when Christina didn't stay with Nick, she always woke up to a good morning text from him. But Nick did not text her that morning, and he wasn't answering his phone. And when she had called into work, someone in Nick's department said he hadn't shown up yet. Nick never overslept, so Christina worried that maybe he had gotten sick the night before and wasn't feeling well enough to get out of bed. Christina hung up her phone, slipped it in her purse, and walked out to her car. She drove right over to Nick's house. A few minutes after 9 a.m., Christina parked her car right out front of Nick's, and as soon as she got out, she instantly knew something was wrong. She could hear Smokey barking loudly from the backyard. Smokey always slept in the bed, and that included the nights when Christina stayed over. And even if Nick had let Smokey outside that morning, he would never have left the dog by himself barking like that. Christina rushed up to the front door and used the house key Nick had given her to open up the door. She walked inside, and what she saw totally confused her. There were all these cleaning products just laying out on the living room floor, like someone had just literally dropped them and then run away. She called out to Nick, but got no response. So she walked upstairs and headed down the hallway towards his bedroom. When she got to the bedroom, she found the door was cracked open. From the hallway, Christina again yelled for Nick, but again, there was no answer. So, after taking a deep breath, Christina pushed the bedroom door open and walked inside. And immediately, she began crying and shaking her head. Nick was laying still on his bed, totally naked and covered in blood. Christina grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Her voice cracked, and she couldn't hold back the tears. She told the dispatcher she believed her fiancé had been shot. Later that morning, Detective Jennifer Garcia of the Pima County Sheriff's Department parked her car a few houses down from Nick's. She could see the crime scene tape that was stretched across Nick's property, and she saw a couple of officers standing with a woman who was hunched over, crying and petting a pit bull. Detective Garcia had butterflies in her stomach. She'd only been a homicide detective for 7 months, and this was the first case she was actually taking the lead on. But Garcia had been preparing for this moment since she was a little girl, really since the first time she saw her grandfather in his police uniform. She had known, even back then, that she also wanted to be a cop when she grew up. And it just so happened that Garcia grew up to be really smart, and she had a keen eye for evidence. So, at a relatively young age, she had already proven to be a very skilled detective. But Garcia knew leading an investigation was a different thing altogether. Still, she believed she was ready. So she took a deep breath, stepped out of her car, and began walking towards Nick's house. Detective Garcia spoke briefly with a few of the officers who had first arrived at the scene. They told her the woman who had found the body, Christina, had identified the victim as her fiancé, Nick Morales. Christina had told the officers about where Nick worked and what his job was, and she also told them that he was a former United States Marine. Garcia thanked the officers, then put on her gloves and headed inside the house. Then she, along with several forensics analysts, started to make their way through the house. And a few things immediately stood out to Garcia. She saw the cleaning products on the living room floor. Then she found that the cabinet under the kitchen sink, where the cleaning products had most likely been stored, was left open. Now, she hadn't even seen the victim yet, but it looked to her like somebody had tried to clean up evidence they left behind, but had abandoned the job. Garcia headed upstairs and into the bedroom, and she saw a ballistics expert cataloging evidence. The ballistics expert told Garcia he had found multiple bullet casings from a .45 caliber handgun. And these casings had a distinct manufacturer's mark on them. There were 5 stars on the head of the casing. Then Garcia walked over to the bed and got a good look at Nick's body. Blood spatter covered the sheets and parts of the wall behind him. But Garcia also noticed some spots of blood that were all over the carpet by the window. And she noticed there was a big square of the carpet that had been cut out, like someone had removed a portion of the carpet. She also noticed a small pile of shattered glass, and so it looked like the window had been broken and then opened. Garcia was pretty sure the window is where the killer had entered the house, but since Nick's bedroom was up on the second floor and not the first floor, she needed to figure out how the killer would have gotten access to the second floor window. Garcia stepped away from the window and walked into the bathroom that connected to the bedroom. She saw more blood spots on the floor, but that really was not the thing that caught her attention. The thing that caught her attention was the bathroom floor had the distinct smell of mouthwash all over it. Garcia thought that was really weird, and she wondered if maybe it was somehow connected to all the cleaning products downstairs, like somebody had tried to disinfect the bathroom floor using this mouthwash. Garcia let the ballistics and forensics team continue their work inside, and she headed downstairs and out to the backyard. And once she was in the backyard, she turned and looked up, and she could see Nick's bedroom window up on the second floor, and she could also see there was a ladder lying on the ground right below it. And so Garcia walked over and picked the ladder up and placed it up against the side of the house. And with this ladder, she was able to climb up and actually get on this small roof that basically sat at the first floor level and kind of wrapped around the small backyard patio, almost like an awning. And she could stand on that awning and actually could see directly in to Nick's bedroom. And there was actually enough space on this little roof that if you wanted to, you could walk over and actually climb into Nick's bedroom window. Garcia climbed back down the ladder, and she already had a pretty good idea about how Nick's killer actually carried out their attack. Not long after Garcia had gotten down from the roof, an officer walked into the backyard and told her that the forensics team had just found something in the garage that she needed to see. So Garcia walked back through the house and then into the garage, and there she found a forensics analyst who was crouched over a bucket. And so she joined him, and she noticed the bucket was filled with water. The analyst pointed to several small threads that were floating in this water, and the analyst told Garcia that these were carpet fibers, and he was almost positive they matched the fibers from the carpet inside the house. And so this discovery helped Garcia make sense of all the cleaning products in the living room and also what she'd seen upstairs. Garcia thought the killer had probably spilled their own blood and tried to clean the carpet and even cut out a piece of it to get rid of that evidence, but they had failed. So Garcia hoped the forensics team would find enough DNA samples to point her right to the murderer. After completing their first sweep of the house, Detective Garcia and members of her team met with Nick's fiancée, Christina, and a few of the neighbors. Garcia got a little more information about Nick's job from Christina, and Christina made it clear that some of the people who worked for Nick were not that fond of him. So Garcia told one of her team members to call Marana Aerospace to see if anybody in particular had a serious grudge against Nick. Then, when Garcia and other investigators spoke to the neighbors, they would say they had not heard anything out of the ordinary the night before or early that morning. That seemed totally weird to Garcia. The houses on Nick's block were pretty close together, and multiple gunshots had to have been fired. I mean, Nick's body was riddled with bullet holes, and based on the broken window and the view of Nick's bed from the roof, Garcia believed at least one of those shots had been fired from outside on the roof into Nick's bedroom. So how did no neighbor hear a gunshot? Garcia knew there was a potential obvious answer to this question. The killer could have been using a suppressor, or a silencer as many people call it, on his gun, which would have limited the sound coming out of the gun when it was fired, basically making it silent. And this immediately gave Garcia another idea. Some new handgun users find it much more difficult to fire accurately when using a suppressor because the suppressor adds weight and length to the barrel of the gun, and it can affect your aim. And this can be an even bigger issue when you're talking about making a long-distance shot. It's just really hard to do it with a suppressor unless you're experienced. So Detective Garcia thought there was a good chance that their shooter was someone who had real firearms training in their background. Garcia went back inside to walk through the house again when she got a call from Marana Aerospace's Human Resources Director. He had heard about what happened to Nick, and he had heard that police had reached out to his company to see if anybody had it out for Nick. And he would tell Garcia that another employee at the company, James Lapon, had recently filed a complaint against Nick. And the HR director had also noticed something strange. James had shown up to work that day wearing a bandage on his arm. Detective Garcia knew the killer had left a trail of blood throughout Nick's room, and maybe that blood was coming from a cut on their arm they got when they climbed in through that broken window. So, after talking to the HR director, Garcia quickly made her way to Marana Aerospace to speak with James and see what was going on with him and Nick. When she got there, an employee led Garcia to one of the airplane hangars where James was working, and right away Garcia noticed that James still had the bandage on his arm. Garcia walked over, introduced herself, and told him that she needed to ask him a few questions, and James said he was happy to answer them. James was 35 years old with brown hair and brown eyes, and he towered over Garcia. He was at least 6 foot 3 inches tall, and he was very physically imposing. But Garcia didn't let that affect her. She asked him why he had filed an HR complaint against Nick, and James, he shook his head and he said he hadn't wanted this to turn into such a big deal. He just felt like Nick had crossed the line a couple of times as a manager with just the way he was treating people, and since Nick was not the easiest guy to talk to, James had gone directly to HR. Garcia nodded and then asked James about the bandage on his arm. James would say he got a pretty bad cut on his arm about a week earlier on the job, and he said there were guys he was working with that could vouch for him, and he said he had reopened the cut while doing some work on his house this past weekend, hence the bandage. Garcia said she would check in with his coworkers, then she told James she had a few more questions. Did he have firearms training? And where had he been the day before and early that morning? James didn't hide anything. He said he did own several guns and he enjoyed going to the gun range and going hunting, and so he did take serious firearms training just so he could be a safe, responsible gun owner. This all made sense to Garcia. Hunting and shooting were very common pastimes in this area. Then James told Garcia that he was at home all day Sunday with his wife and kids. He and his wife had gone to bed together that night, and then he woke up Monday morning and went right to work. Then James peered down at Garcia, and he told her, look, I never liked Nick. I'm not going to pretend I like Nick, but I would never have done anything to hurt the guy. Garcia thanked James for taking the time to talk to her, and then she walked out of the hangar. And it wouldn't take her long to walk around the company and find several people who had witnessed James get hurt on the job. So that could possibly explain the bandage on his arm. But after making the rounds at Marana Aerospace, Garcia quickly realized that a disgruntled employee like James might not be the most likely suspect, because she heard that Nick had made at least a couple of women he worked with really, really mad. And this had to do with romantic relationships, which historically absolutely lead to murder and conflict and violence. So Garcia headed back to the sheriff's station to set up a series of interviews. That evening, Garcia met with James's wife. She was an Army vet who prided herself on being straightforward, and she told Garcia basically the same story her husband had, that they had spent Sunday with their kids and then they had gone to bed. And she would tell Garcia that, she knew her husband had not been a fan of Nick, but from her perspective, it just seemed like this was the usual way people got fed up with their bosses. It was nothing more than that. Detective Garcia thanked her for coming in. It was too early to cross anyone off the list of potential suspects, but James's wife had not given Garcia any reason to doubt that she was telling the truth. So now, Garcia turned her focus from Nick's work life to his romantic life. On July 19th, a day after Nick's body was discovered, Garcia sat across the table inside of a cramped interrogation room from one of Nick's ex-girlfriends, Claudia Banks. Claudia got really animated when she spoke, and she seemed very ready and willing to talk a lot. But what Claudia had to say was really not what Garcia had expected. Garcia assumed she was in for an angry rant over a jilted lover. But instead, Claudia told the detective that Nick had been really awesome. She said he was a great listener and a lot of fun to hang out with. Garcia sat there for a second feeling stunned. From what she'd heard back at Marana Aerospace, Nick's exes had been really mad at him, and some had even complained to HR about him. Claudia said she did not fit that description at all. She said she was totally happy for Nick when he got engaged, and now she was devastated that he was gone. Then Claudia got a very angry, serious look on her face, and she told Garcia there were two people police really needed to speak to: Nick's other ex-girlfriend, Jessica Stillwell, and her own ex-boyfriend, Justin Skinner. Garcia leaned forward in her chair. She had not heard Justin's name before. But Claudia said that, when she and Nick were together, their relationship had actually come after they had broken two other people's hearts. Remember, Nick had kicked Jessica out of his house after she caught him cheating on her, and Claudia was pretty sure Jessica had never forgiven Nick for that. And Claudia dumped her boyfriend at the time, Justin, to be with Nick. But according to Claudia, this was not even the most significant part of the story. Claudia said on Sunday, the night before Nick's body was found, she had been hanging out with her mother at a bar when out of nowhere, her old ex, Justin, walked in. Claudia said she had done her best to avoid Justin after they had broken up because he had gone full-blown stalker mode, hanging out outside of her work, following Nick in his car, and stuff like that. And at the bar that Sunday, Justin had tried to talk to Claudia, but she wasn't having it, so she and her mother left. But then, just that morning, only a day after somebody murdered Nick, Claudia found a note on her front door. And the note was from Justin saying how sorry he was about Nick's death and that if Claudia needed someone to talk to, he was there for her. Detective Garcia stared across the table at Claudia. The story sounded too on the nose to be real. The stalker ex-boyfriend who hated Nick for, stealing his girl just happened to show up where she was the night before the murder, and then he had a note for her the day after Nick turned up dead? Garcia thanked Claudia and told her she could go now. The detective still wanted to talk to Nick's other ex-girlfriend, Jessica, but now it seemed like Justin was the highest on her suspect list. The following day, Detective Garcia drove to Justin's house to meet with him. The temperature had hit 105 degrees Fahrenheit, and Garcia could feel herself starting to sweat just during the short walk from her car to his front door. She knocked on the door, and Justin let her inside. Garcia followed him into the kitchen, subtly looking around his house while she walked. Nothing really stood out about the house. It looked like a lot of the places she had seen that belonged to other single guys, a little cluttered and not much decoration. But something about Justin caught Garcia's attention right away. He had several long scratches on both of his arms. Garcia sat down with Justin at the kitchen table, and she got right to the point. She asked him if he still blamed Nick for breaking up his relationship with Claudia. Justin said he was not mad anymore about Nick and Claudia, and that he had let it all go, but when he was telling Garcia this, he didn't look up at her, he didn't make eye contact. And so she was pretty sure he didn't fully mean what he was saying, that maybe he was still mad. So Garcia said in response, if he had let things go, why had he shown up at the bar where Claudia had been on Sunday night, and why did he leave her a note just a day after Nick had been found dead? Justin's voice got real quiet, and he almost immediately began to backtrack what he had just said. He told Garcia that actually he did want to get back together with Claudia. He missed her. But he made it very clear he had nothing to do with Nick's murder. Garcia stayed on him and asked him about the cuts on his arms. Justin looked down at his arms and he kind of laughed, and he said he was a landscaper, so he always had little cuts all over his arms and hands. It was just part of his work. He didn't even think about them anymore. Garcia looked across the table at Justin. She couldn't quite get a read on him. Was he a broken-hearted guy who was just awkward and overbearing and trying to get his girlfriend back? Or was he jealous and angry enough to go kill a man to try to get his girlfriend back? So Garcia asked Justin if he would provide police with a DNA sample. She said it would be quick and easy, she would just swab his cheek. But Justin shook his head and said, no, I don't want to do that. Garcia smiled and told him she totally understood. Something like this could feel very invasive. Then Garcia stood up, and for a second, it must have seemed to Justin like she was about to leave, but she stopped and turned around and leaned in towards Justin, and with a smile on her face, she told him the best way to clear his name and to make sure everybody knew he did have nothing to do with Nick's death was to provide a DNA sample right here, right now. Justin looked up at Garcia, and with a very determined look on his face like he was about to do something big, he told Garcia, okay, I will provide a DNA sample. A little while later, Garcia headed back to the station with Justin's DNA sample for testing. The results would take some time to get back, so she prepared to interview another potential suspect, Nick's other ex-girlfriend, Jessica Stillwell. Later that day, Garcia met with Jessica in the same interview room where she'd met with Nick's other ex-girlfriend, Claudia. But from the moment Jessica sat down, Garcia could tell this interview was going to be very different from her interview with Claudia. Jessica looked angry, and unlike Claudia, she did not think Nick had been really awesome. She said Nick had cheated on her in full view of her, and then totally broken her heart by basically kicking her out of the house and not caring at all about her. But she said that was not the only reason she had been so upset. Jessica also had a daughter, and when things fell apart with Nick, her daughter had been spending a ton of time at his house too, and so she was really sad. She missed Nick, and so the whole thing had just screwed up this little girl's life. Garcia listened and nodded along as Jessica spoke, like she was a friend who Jessica could confide in. And as she did this, it struck Garcia that if Jessica was involved in Nick's murder, she really was not trying to hide it. This was a woman who obviously carried a very serious grudge against Nick. Finally, after several minutes of ranting and raving, Jessica stopped talking. So Garcia asked her where she'd been on Sunday and then Monday morning, the time period when Nick was killed. Jessica said that she and her daughter had stayed at her mother's house the entire weekend, and then she woke up and drove to work from there on Monday. Garcia asked if Jessica would mind handing over her phone for a little while before she left. Garcia explained that police could download information and text messages from her phone, and that would be the easiest way for them to confirm Jessica's alibi. They would be able to tell if she really had been at her mother's house. Jessica had no hesitation. She reached into her pocket and put her phone on the table and told Garcia the police could do whatever they needed. She was telling the truth, and so she had nothing to hide. Garcia thanked her and then left the room with the phone. And at this point, police conducted a forensics download on the phone that would provide them with cell phone location data. But it would also give investigators a look at who Jessica had been texting with and what she had been saying in those messages. On July 21st, 2016, so 3 days after Nick's body had been found, Detective Garcia sat working at her desk. She had a handful of legitimate suspects, and she was still waiting on 2 pieces of evidence that could potentially break the case wide open: Justin's DNA results and a complete view of all Jessica's text messages. In the meantime, Garcia went back over her interviews from Nick's work to see if she had overlooked anything. Then Garcia's phone rang, and it was Nick's brother on the other line. Garcia had spoken to him once before, soon after Nick's death, but he said this call had nothing to do with that first interview. Nick's brother said he had just talked to one of Nick's friends, and this friend was pretty sure he had important information about this case. Garcia took down the friend's details, thanked Nick's brother, and then called Nick's friend. The guy was at work, so Garcia told him not to go anywhere. She would head right over. Not long after the call, Garcia made her way through Tucson and arrived at a metal fabrication shop that Nick's friend managed. Garcia went inside. The place was loud, and several men were wearing these huge welder's helmets and were hard at work on different projects, but Garcia found Nick's friend waiting for her already at the front desk. He told Garcia that after the initial shock and grief of Nick's death had subsided a bit, he started thinking about anybody who might have wanted to hurt his friend. And then he remembered something he thought could be big. Months earlier, somebody who knew Nick well had come into the shop asking for a few specific pieces of equipment. Nick's friend said that even at the time, he thought the order was a little strange, because he could really only think of one thing those pieces of equipment could be used for. Garcia asked him what he meant, and Nick's friend said, well, the equipment could be used to repair a firearm suppressor or silencer. Garcia's face lit up. She asked Nick's friend, please tell me you have a record of that purchase. And he said he did, and he had actually already pulled the information for her. Nick's friend handed Garcia the receipt with the list of items and the buyer's information. And when Garcia saw the buyer's name, she immediately felt a rush. She thanked Nick's friend and hustled out to her car. Garcia had spent only a week on her first case as a lead homicide detective, and already she was sure she had just solved the crime. Based on that receipt from the metal fabrication shop, multiple interviews, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Nick in the early morning hours of July 18th, 2016. At around 4 a.m. that morning, the killer parked their car a few houses down from Nick's. They knew the neighborhood would be dark and quiet that time of morning. They also knew the perfect place to stage their attack. The killer got out of their car and walked quickly down the street towards Nick's house. They wore all black clothes and a pair of gloves. On one hip, the killer had a .45 caliber handgun with a suppressor attached, and on the other hip was a folded pocket knife inside of a leather sheath. The killer avoided the glow of a few streetlights and then walked around Nick's house to the backyard. The killer hopped the low fence and scanned the yard. They saw a ladder leaned up against the wall where they knew Nick kept it. The killer moved across the yard quickly and quietly. They grabbed the ladder and placed it against the house near the back porch and climbed up onto that kind of small roof, that awning where you could easily see into Nick's bedroom. And so once up on that roof, the killer got in position kind of right outside of Nick's window. They knelt down, and from their spot, they could clearly see Nick in his bed. And so the killer took the gun off their hip, they took a slow breath, they raised their gun, and they fired. The glass in the window shattered, and the bullet struck Nick as he lay in bed. But the gun, because of the silencer, made virtually no noise, and so nobody in the neighborhood heard any of this happening. But the killer didn't waste any time. They took a few steps forward and reached through the now shattered window. They unlocked the window, opened it up, and began to climb through it. The killer heard the sound of a dog barking inside the room, and they felt a piece of broken glass cut into their arm as they climbed through. The pain stung, but they couldn't worry about that now. The killer landed on Nick's bedroom floor, and they saw glass from the window all around them. Nick's dog barked and ran around the room, but it did not attack the killer. The killer looked over at Nick, who was lying in bed, and the killer could see Nick was not moving. But the killer didn't want to take any chances, and so as they walked across the room towards Nick's bed, the killer raised their silenced pistol and fired multiple shots into Nick's body. And then finally, when the killer was standing right over Nick, they aimed their gun right at Nick's forehead and shot him one more time, execution style. And so at this point, there was no question Nick was deceased. But the killer felt that sting from the cut on their arm, and they glanced back to see there was a trail of blood dripping behind them. And so the killer started to panic, and the dog kept on barking, which really stressed the killer out. And so the killer slipped their silenced pistol back into their waistband, and then looked around the dark room, and then headed towards the bathroom door. They stepped inside the bathroom, turned on the light, and then stuck their arm under the sink and began to wash off their cut. But when the killer turned to leave, they saw there was blood still on the bathroom floor from their cut. So, kind of impulsively, the killer grabbed a bottle of mouthwash from the counter and just poured it all over the floor and rubbed their shirt sleeves all over it, attempting to clean up the blood with it. But it was not working, and the dog just kept on barking over and over and over again. So the killer just rushed back into the bedroom, grabbed the dog by the collar, and ran downstairs and put it out in the backyard. The killer closed the back door, turned, and headed back towards the kitchen. There, they opened up the cabinet under the sink and grabbed cleaning products, a hand towel, and a bucket. They filled the bucket with water and carried all their supplies upstairs to the bedroom. Once there, they turned on the light, and they saw there was all this blood spatter on the carpet. Now, the killer knew a lot of that blood was Nick's, but for sure, some of it had to be the killer's blood. So they got down on their hands and knees and sprayed one of the cleaning products on the floor, dipped the towel in the bucket of water, and started scrubbing. And each time they dipped the towel in the bucket, they would leave carpet fibers behind in the water. But no matter how hard they scrubbed, the blood just was not coming out of this carpet, and it was taking way too much time trying to clean it. So they dropped the cleaning supplies, they took out their pocket knife off their hip, and they cut this big bloody piece of carpet away and carried it and the cleaning supplies out of the room, and they headed downstairs. But by this point, the killer was well aware that things had really not gone to plan, and at this point, the killer just wanted to get the heck out of the house. So they just dropped the cleaning products on the living room floor, but they held on to that towel they were using to scrub the carpet, as well as the actual chunk of carpet they cut away. Then the killer also hid the bucket of water in the garage, hoping nobody would find it. Then the killer ran back upstairs, went into Nick's bedroom, they climbed back out the window onto that roof, then he climbed down the ladder and then lowered the ladder onto the ground so it didn't look as obvious that he had used it to climb to the second floor, and then he climbed over the exterior fence around the property, leaving behind Smokey the dog in the backyard, and the killer just ran the rest of the way back to their car. The killer would then speed home, change out of their clothes, and put a big old bandage on their arm, and then drive into work at Marana Aerospace Solutions. James Lapon, the man who had filed that HR complaint, had murdered Nick. But James's reasoning behind the murder went much deeper than just some run-ins the two men had at work. It would turn out James was having an affair with Jessica, one of Nick's ex-girlfriends. And apparently, Jessica still talked all the time about Nick, and it totally drove James crazy, so he killed Nick. Garcia had first discovered this relationship between James and Jessica when Jessica had handed over her phone. They had seen the text messages between them. And soon after that, James had actually admitted to the affair as well. But he still at the time said he had nothing to do with Nick's murder. But investigators dove deeper into Jessica's text messages, and they found several exchanges between her and James that seemed really strange. In one of those messages, James implied he was going to, quote, handle his problems with Nick. In another, James asked what kind of dog Nick had, and Jessica told him it was a pit bull. Then, investigators found maybe the strangest message on Jessica's phone, Nick telling her to delete all of their text conversations. Soon after receiving those text messages, Detective Garcia received the DNA test results of her other major suspect, Justin Skinner. And Justin's samples did not match samples found at the murder scene. So Garcia definitely saw James as her primary suspect. After all, he even had this mysterious cut on his arm. Then Nick's friend at the metal fabrication shop had handed over the receipt from the customer who had bought equipment to potentially repair a firearms suppressor, and Detective Garcia saw James's name on that receipt. And so at that point, she was certain he was the murderer. Garcia got a warrant to search James's house, and when investigators did the search, they would find boxes of bullets inside of his house that had the same unique marking as the bullet casings found at the murder scene, the 5 stars on the casing head. And so at that point, police would arrest James for Nick's murder. Some investigators thought that Jessica could have been involved in her ex-boyfriend's murder, but she was ultimately never charged with anything connected to the crime. At James's trial, one of the most important testimonies came from his own wife. During the investigation, she had corroborated James's alibi. But when James was in prison awaiting trial, his wife had watched this movie in which an abused wife stands up to her abusive husband. And apparently when she saw this, it really spoke to her, and so it made her decide she had to tell the truth. James's wife admitted that she had lied to police. She said James was violent and abusive, and she was scared he would hurt her and her kids if she didn't do what he said. She told the jury she knew James had murdered Nick. And when he came home from killing Nick, he had told her exactly what to say to police. In the end, the jury found James guilty of first-degree murder, and James was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On a cold and snowy day in January of 1994, a land surveyor for the North Carolina Department of Transportation parked his car at the edge of Highway 421 in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. After walking just a few yards away from the side of the road, he was already swallowed up in the deep woods that stretched for miles into Watauga County. Given the cold air and snow underfoot, the surveyor was paying close attention to where he was walking and hoping that the job would not take long and he'd be back inside his warm vehicle before his toes actually froze. That was until the man glanced ahead at the fallen tree ahead of him, and before he saw something he just couldn't make sense of peeking out of the snow in the shadow of the upended roots. Squinting, the man took a few more steps closer just to make sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. A moment later, he dropped the hard plastic case that contained his surveying equipment and nearly fell backward as he scrambled to get away from the mound of snow in front of him. Then, looking desperately through the thick trees for the other members of the survey team, the calm around him was shattered as he started yelling for help. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please buy a billboard along the highway and on it place a massive photo of the Amazon Music follow button when they were in the 4th grade and rocked a sweet bowl cut. Okay, let's get into today's story. "41-year-old Victor Gunnarsson looked out the window of his small apartment in Salisbury, North Carolina. It was Wednesday afternoon, December 1st, 1993, and another mild winter had settled over the Tar Heel state. Even though Victor had lived in America now for almost 8 years, the onset of what passed for cold in this part of the world still brought back sharp memories of the country where Victor was born and where he had expected, at one time, to spend his entire life. If Victor were waking up today in Sweden, 4,500 miles to the north and east of where he stood right now, he'd be welcoming the start of the coldest month of the year, with freezing temperatures that were nearly 20 degrees lower on average than where he lived now, and days so short that the sun would be setting by 3 p.m. in the afternoon. In Sweden, Victor would be piling on wool sweaters and overcoats. Here in Salisbury, he hardly ever had to wear anything warmer than his leather bomber jacket. Turning away from the window, Victor gave himself a small mental shrug. He felt lucky that he didn't miss his homeland more than he did, because for Victor, leaving Sweden had been a matter of necessity, not choice. Back in 1986, Victor's big talk about his anti-communist views, along with his right-wing activism, had gotten him in so much trouble that he'd basically been driven out of his politically liberal homeland. And even if he went back to Sweden's capital city of Stockholm, where he used to live, Victor knew he would not be any more welcome now than he had been 8 years earlier. What still surprised the tall, handsome Swede with the dark hair and intense blue eyes was that he finally felt okay about all of that. When he'd had to leave Stockholm, he'd chosen the US because he'd enjoyed the time he'd once spent vacationing in sunny California, but he'd wound up settling not on the West Coast, but here in central North Carolina, where the weather was warm, cost of living was reasonable, and where the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains were within a day's drive of the Lakewood apartment complex that Victor now called home. And here in the south of the United States, Victor's conservative views didn't raise so many eyebrows, and his naturally gregarious personality had meshed seamlessly with the region's legendary southern hospitality and friendliness. And it hadn't taken Victor long since he'd arrived before he'd put his ability to speak 9 different languages to good use. Within weeks of getting settled here and advertising his services as a language tutor, Victor began to get so many requests for help that he'd had to start putting prospective students on a waiting list. Now, earning $50 an hour, which would be the equivalent of about $100 today, Victor wasn't rich, but he did feel financially comfortable. Victor had also very quickly found his niche in Salisbury as a ladies' man. From the second he had arrived, Victor made no bones about how much he enjoyed female company in every size, shape, and age. And even after the short but passionate affairs that Victor favored ended, he almost always remained on very friendly terms with his former lovers. The South was also a place where Victor, who liked to exaggerate when it came to describing his life experiences, found a willing audience. In addition to his magnetic personality, the fact that he was from Sweden and spoke so many languages gave him an exotic and cosmopolitan gloss that women and men found very interesting. Now, opening up one of the kitchen drawers and picking out a sharp paring knife, Victor thought about the latest woman in his life and smiled. Reaching for the fresh tomatoes that were piled on the counter in front of him, he put one of them on the cutting board and then looked down at his gold watch to check the time. Just 5 days ago, on the Friday after Thanksgiving, Victor had met a local high school teacher named Kay Whedon, who was housing a foreign exchange student from Denmark. And the attraction between Victor and Kay, who was 40 years old and, like Victor, divorced, had been immediate and very strong. The two of them had been brought together by a mutual friend who had told Kay that Kay's exchange student, Mikkel, who was there attending the local high school, might enjoy talking in his native language with Victor. Since that first meeting, Victor and Kay had spent a few more evenings with one another, and while their relationship was still purely platonic, Kay had asked Victor over to her house for dinner tonight so he could meet Mikkel and also Kay's 15-year-old only child, a son named Jason. Victor had been thrilled, and he told Kay not to worry about cooking, that he would provide the food, spaghetti with the homemade sauce he was now in the process of making. And if all went well, Victor thought, as he moved through the steps of a pasta recipe he knew by heart, maybe he and Kay, a smart and attractive woman who taught high school English and drama, would become more than just friends. On Friday, December 3rd, Victor got his wish. Victor's homemade spaghetti dinner 2 evenings earlier had been such a success that Kay was eager to move their relationship forward. Victor had hit it off right away with both Mikkel and Jason, and now Kay wanted Victor to meet one of the most important people in Kay's life, Kay's 77-year-old mother, Catherine Miller. Even though she was 12 years past retirement age, Catherine was still working hard as an accounts clerk at W.A. Brown, an industrial refrigeration company that had been a local fixture in Salisbury for more than 80 years. Now a widow, Catherine devoted her spare time to church and volunteer activities, and to playing a very big role in the lives of her grandson Jason and her only daughter Kay. And ever since Kay had moved to Salisbury after her divorce 6 years ago, Catherine had kept a very protective and, lately, a very worried eye on her daughter's love life. Catherine had heard all about an earlier date Kay had gone on back in November with a man named David Sumner, who Kay had met through a, quote, reputable dating agency, end quote. Their first get-together at a local lunch spot was promising, but the dinner date that followed a few days later had turned out to be a disaster. So when Kay had started talking about this intelligent and good-looking man named Victor, who was so different from Kay's expectation that a Swede would be pale-skinned and blonde, Catherine was very interested in meeting the new person in Kay's life. And when Kay had asked Catherine to join Kay and Victor at the Blue Bay Seafood Restaurant that night of December 3rd, Catherine hadn't hesitated even a second before saying yes. And now, as the three of them sat at a table for four near a window at Blue Bay and placed their dinner orders, Catherine thought that overall, Victor seemed friendly and courteous. He was definitely a talker, except when it came to exactly why he had left his home in Sweden's capital city of Stockholm 8 years earlier. But then again, Catherine thought to herself, everyone had their secrets, and Catherine wondered how much Kay had told Victor about the problems that Kay had been having in her own life. It wasn't until the end of the meal, when Victor took his last bite of his baked potato and motioned to the server that he was ready for the check, that dinner hit one small sour note. That was when Victor took the money that Catherine had offered to him to cover the cost of her own meal, but instead of giving Catherine any change or refusing Catherine's offer, Victor used Catherine's money to pay the entire tab. And the only contribution he made was to take a few dollars from his pocket and tuck them under his plate for the tip. A few minutes later, as Catherine, Victor, and Kay stood up and put on their coats before heading out the door and into the cool night air to the parking lot, Kay, who had also noticed this telltale sign that Victor was very likely tight with money, gave her mother an embarrassed shrug. Maybe, Catherine thought, as Victor held the car door of Kay's car open for Catherine to slide in before he stepped away to get into his own car to drive back to Lakewood Apartments where he lived, Victor didn't hate the welfare state, which is how he described Sweden, quite as much as he said he did, because he certainly didn't mind taking from the person who was supposed to be his guest. But later that night, when Kay and Victor were sitting outside in Kay's yard next to the fire pit, Kay at least had put that single awkward moment at the restaurant out of her mind. After dropping her mother off at 118 Larch Road and reminding her mom to make sure her alarm system was on for the night, Kay had headed back to her own house to wait for Victor, who had wanted to go to his own apartment and change into more comfortable clothing before coming back to join Kay. When Victor arrived at Sycamore Road, Jason and Mikkel were out with friends, which meant Kay and Victor had 3 hours alone together. When Jason and Mikkel got back to the house at about 10 p.m., Kay and Victor joined the teens and a few of their friends out in the side yard to enjoy a fire in the fire pit. Now, as Kay and Victor sat next to one another, their fingers entwined, Kay noticed the glint of a small diamond set in the heavy gold signet ring that Victor always wore on his left hand. When Kay asked about the ring, Victor took it off and told her that the 3 letters engraved around the diamond meant strength and courage. As their eyes met over the ring, Kay's heart skipped a beat, especially after the hours that she and Victor had just spent alone. Kay hoped that there would be many more evenings just like this in the months ahead. Those thoughts were interrupted a few minutes later when Kay was startled by the sight of a car pulling into the end of her driveway. But a moment later, when she saw the car was just using her driveway to turn around and head back the way it had just come, she forced her shoulders to relax. An hour later, at about 11:15, Victor gave Kay's hand a gentle squeeze, then leaned over and told her that it was time for him to go back to his own apartment. And 10 minutes after that, while Jason and his friends were still enjoying the fire, Kay was standing just inside the front door of the house saying goodnight to Victor. After a long kiss, Victor stepped back, smiled, and promised Kay he would call her the next day. Then, as Kay watched, the big man with black hair and intense blue eyes shoved his hands deep into his pockets, walked down the porch steps, and back to his car. 35 days later, and 100 miles northwest of Salisbury, A land surveyor working with a North Carolina state highway crew up in Watauga County was picking his way through the dense woods off Highway 421, near the summit of one of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The highway department service vehicles were parked about 300 yards away alongside the edge of an entrance ramp leading onto the Blue Ridge Parkway, a scenic route through the mountain range that was closed at the moment due to uncleared ice and snow. As soon as the surveyor had stepped out of the warm vehicle, the cold mountain air and wind hit him like a fist, but after just a few steps, he had entered the relative shelter of thick trees. As he moved through the snow, the man's eyes swept back and forth across the ground just ahead of him. He didn't want to take any chances that he might miss the iron property marker he was looking for. After making his way around a large clump of mountain laurel, the surveyor stopped for a second to look up and take stock of his surroundings. Directly in front of him was a huge pine tree that had fallen or been knocked over by the wind. Facing the surveyor were the upended and snow-covered roots of the tree. And in the indentation in the earth where all those roots had once dug into the ground, the surveyor suddenly noticed something out of place in the snow just a few steps in front of him. The surveyor squinted, sure that his eyes were playing tricks on him. Then, moving much more slowly now, the man took one more step closer and then froze. Sticking out of the white snow immediately in front of the surveyor were two bare human feet. The toes and flesh of one foot had been chewed down to the bone by small animals, but the big toe on the left foot, large with a bristle of black hairs, a man's foot, was still intact. Suddenly gagging, the surveyor stumbled backward, then turned and ran a few yards back along the path he had just made through the snow. Then, pausing to catch his breath and looking over his shoulder again at the fallen pine tree, he dropped his case of equipment into the snow, opened his mouth, and yelled for help. By 2 p.m., the entrance ramp to the Blue Ridge Parkway was crowded with law enforcement vehicles and personnel. In response to the 911 call that had come in a few minutes earlier from the state highway crew reporting that what appeared to be a man's dead body had been found in the woods, 2 patrol cars from the Watauga County Sheriff's Department had been first on the scene, where they were soon joined by members of the Blue Ridge National Park Service. By the time Detective Sergeant Paula May from the Division of Criminal Investigations in the Watauga Sheriff's Department had arrived, the area around the fallen pine tree was taped off, and the surveyor, who had discovered the body under a mound of snow in the shadow of the upended tree roots, couldn't wait to give his statement to police, and then get out of the woods and back into a warm car as fast as possible. Detective May couldn't blame him. The temperature, already well below freezing, was dropping steadily. And this was only the beginning of what the 6-year veteran with the Sheriff's Department knew would be a very long and very cold night. But in this case, the investigator also knew that in this situation, the cold and snow might work to the advantage of law enforcement. The large body that was clearly buried, except for the feet, under a mound of snow near the fallen pine tree had probably been well preserved by the recent cold temperatures. And if decomposition had been minimal, then the body might yield valuable clues about the identity of this person, along with the cause and time of their death. But aside from her assumption, based on the feet and the size of the body under the snow, that the victim was a man, the fact that the victim appeared to be naked raised more questions than answers. It basically ruled out 2 of the more common causes of death out here in the woods, suicide or an accident. And that left the third option, that what she was looking at here was likely a homicide. And that would open the door to a very complicated investigation because murders could be committed for all kinds of reasons and by all kinds of people. And unless police found the man's clothing and some form of ID, there was also the challenge of finding out who this victim was. Detective May knew at the moment there were no active reports of missing people in Watauga County. And even before she left the woods later that evening, she also knew that one of her first tasks would be to check on missing person reports outside of the county, both in the larger region and statewide. Within a few hours of Detective May's arrival, the Watauga County Sheriff had already made a call to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation asking for help. And not long after that, the area around the snow-covered body began to fill with members of a state crime tech unit and an agent assigned to work closely with Detective May. It wasn't until after the scene was photographed, sketched, and processed that the medical examiner oversaw the removal of the body. And after one small scoop of snow at a time had been lifted off the corpse, investigators finally got their first look at the nude adult white male who lay underneath the mound of snow. The bare skin of the man's back was frozen to the ground. His wide-open mouth showed a set of straight white teeth. In his left temple, just below the line of dark hair that still covered what was left of his scalp, investigators could see a clearly defined circle where a bullet had been fired into his skull. And on the right side of the man's neck, there was a second bullet hole. There was no sign anywhere of the man's clothes, and no shell casings from the rounds that were fired, but the body was not completely stripped. On the man's left wrist was a gold watch, and on his left hand, he wore a heavy gold signet ring with a small center diamond. The only other physical item left at the scene of what investigators now knew had to have been a murder was a 16-inch long strip of electrical and masking tape, the same kind of tape that investigators would later find had been used to bind the man's hands and ankles. By the next morning, when the medical examiner was preparing to conduct an autopsy on the body found in the woods the night before, Detective May had already made much more progress on the case than she had believed possible when she had first laid eyes on the dead man. In fact, she now believed she had identified their John Doe. The young detective had spent the night before at her office putting out a statewide call for active reports on missing adult middle-aged white males. And within hours, she had gotten a call from the police department in Salisbury, North Carolina, 90 miles to the southeast. The lieutenant told her about a 41-year-old Swedish national named Victor Gunnarsson who had been reported missing by his landlord 23 days earlier on December 15, 1993. Victor's physical description, 41 years old, 6 foot 2 inches tall, 225 pounds, matched what Detective May had seen in the woods. But it was the recent photograph attached to the missing persons report from Salisbury that made the investigator's heart beat faster. The man in the photo with the dark hair and straight white teeth was wearing a gold watch and a heavy gold signet ring that looked exactly like the jewelry she had seen on the dead man in the woods. But it was what the Salisbury investigator told Detective May next when she asked what else the officer knew about Victor Gunnarsson that literally took Detective May's breath away. Because, as Detective May was about to find out, Victor Gunnarsson was no ordinary Swedish citizen. Victor Gunnarsson was in fact a major player in a political assassination that had taken place 8 years earlier, an assassination that was still unsolved and still the subject of international intrigue and speculation. That assassination had taken place on the evening of Friday, February 28, 1986, in the capital city of Stockholm, Sweden, when the country's popular prime minister and his wife, unescorted by bodyguards, were walking home from an evening out at the movies. The assassin had walked up behind the couple and fired 2 bullets at close range. The first hit Olof Palme in the back, killing him almost instantly, while the second bullet grazed and slightly injured Palme's wife, Lisbeth. And among the first suspects in that high-profile homicide was Victor Gunnarsson. Known at the time to Swedish police for his right-wing extremist views, Victor had been spotted earlier that same evening in a nearby bar where he had been heard ranting about the Prime Minister's socialist economic and foreign policies. Within hours of the shooting, Victor, who was then 33 years old, was picked up for questioning and then let go, only to be brought back into police custody 2 more times for detention and interrogation. He was finally released after an eyewitness to the assassination could not positively identify Victor as the shooter. But being released from police custody was not at all the same thing as being cleared of suspicion. As long as the case went unsolved, Victor remained a person of interest. As the target of continued surveillance as well as public mistrust, Victor had trouble keeping a job and living a normal life. So, after receiving a settlement for wrongful detention from the government, Victor decided it was time to leave Sweden and start a new life in America, where he eventually settled in Salisbury, North Carolina. Within days of Detective May's discovery, Swedish officials were able to confirm that the fingerprints taken from the man found in the North Carolina woods did match those of Victor Gunnarsson. By that time, the autopsy report had also come back. The contents in Victor's stomach, which included bits of potato skin, showed that he had probably eaten dinner about 4 hours before his death. The medical examiner had also determined that Victor had been bound with masking and electrical tape and confirmed that Victor had been killed execution-style with one bullet to the head and one to the throat. The cause of death immediately ignited speculation in the US and in Sweden that Victor himself had become the victim of an assassination, and that his death must be related somehow to the 1986 murder of the Swedish Prime Minister. But as detectives in both Watauga County, where Victor's body was found, and in Salisbury, where Victor lived, began to work the homicide case together, what increasingly drew their attention wasn't just Victor's link to an 8-year-old political assassination, it was Victor's link to Salisbury resident and high school teacher Kay Whedon. What made that link interesting to detectives was the fact that Victor was not the only recent homicide victim who had lived in Salisbury and been a part of Kay's life. By now, results from Victor's autopsy, coupled with information detectives had gathered from Victor's friends and neighbors and from Kay herself, had helped police narrow the date of Victor's actual death to early December, probably around December 3rd, which was when Victor had gone out to dinner with Kay and eaten the baked potato, bits of which were later found inside of his stomach. And it was just a few days after December 3rd, on December 9th, that Kay Whedon's mother, 77-year-old Catherine Miller, had also been murdered. And like Victor, she had been shot twice in the head at close range. So, even as Detective May and law enforcement from the state and Salisbury Police Department continued to track down any information they could about Victor's political activities here in the United States, investigators also focused their attention on finding out all they could about Kay, the one person who represented the strongest link between two very similar brutal homicides that claimed the lives of two Salisbury residents. By the time Detective May joined forces with Salisbury investigators in mid-January, Salisbury police had already discovered that Kay herself also appeared to be in potential danger. Since Victor's disappearance and the death of her mother, Kay and her son Jason had both become the targets of telephone calls and letters accusing Jason of involvement with local drug dealers and threatening both mother and son with physical violence. When Kay sat down with investigators to tell them about her relationship with Victor, she told detectives that she had been crushed when Victor had not followed through on his promise to call her the day after their dinner together at the Blue Bay restaurant on December 3rd. But any worry or hurt Kay had felt about Victor's sudden silence and apparent disappearance, and any concern over the apparent stalker or stalkers who had started sending these awful letters and calling her and her son at all hours to threaten them, had been totally blotted out of her mind when she received the terrible news on December 9th that her mother had been murdered. That was the morning that Catherine's body had been found by a coworker from W.A. Brown, who had been so concerned that Catherine was late to work that he went directly to her home on Larch Street to make sure she was okay. When the coworker had stepped into Catherine's kitchen, he'd been horrified to find Catherine slumped in a seated position on the floor, her back against a white refrigerator and the top of her head blown off. After ruling out both Kay and her son Jason as suspects, police concentrated first on interviewing Catherine's friends and coworkers. Even though Catherine's house had a security system installed, there was no sign of forced entry, which made police believe the older woman must have known her attacker and opened the door to let them in. But after finding zero evidence that anyone close to Catherine would want her dead, police turned their attention again to Kay, thinking that Catherine's murder might be connected to something going on in Kay's life, or to someone close to Kay. People of interest had included Kay's former boyfriend, a Salisbury police officer named Lamont Claxton Underwood, who worked as a resource officer at Salisbury High School, as well as other men like David Sumner, who Kay had dated after she broke up with Officer Underwood and before she met Victor Gunnarsson. But no matter how hard they probed, detectives couldn't find any physical evidence to link anyone in Kay's circle of friends and acquaintances to the murder of Catherine Miller. But after the discovery of Victor's body, investigators in Salisbury had additional leads to follow. It looked to Detective May and Salisbury's lead investigator Don Gale like Victor Gunnarsson must have been kidnapped from his home in Salisbury and transported, probably by car, up to Watauga County where he was actually killed. But even after circling back to Officer Underwood, who had re-entered Kay's life as a friend after Kay's mother had died, and who had access to firearms, police still came up empty. All police discovered when they searched their fellow officer's home and car on February 1st, 1994, was that Lamont Claxton, LC for short, was neat to the point of being compulsive about order and cleanliness. As for a connection between Victor's murder and the assassination of Sweden's prime minister in 1986, that lead also petered out. Years before, Victor had apparently cut his ties to any right-wing extremist groups, and state and local police in North Carolina could not find one scrap of evidence among Victor's personal belongings or information gathered through interviews with his associates that related in any way to the death of Prime Minister Olof Palme. By the fall of 1994, 11 months after Victor Gunnarsson disappeared from his apartment in Salisbury, all the main characters in the unsolved murders of Victor and also Catherine Miller had started to move on with their lives. Kay, unable to stand being so close to the home where her mother had died, sold her house on Sycamore Road and moved to a new home 5 miles to the south, and the harassment that had terrorized her and Jason stopped. Both Kay and Elsie Underwood each had new romantic partners, and no one had stepped forward to claim a $50,000 reward offered by North Carolina's governor for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Victor's murderer, just as no one in Salisbury or Watauga County responded to a police bulletin asking for information about the .22 caliber weapon used to kill Victor, or the .38 caliber weapon used to kill Catherine. It wouldn't be until the fall of 1995, almost 2 years after Salisbury's 24,000 residents had been shaken to the core by those two homicides, that Watauga County Detective Paula May and Salisbury Detective Don Gale would get the news they had been hoping for. News that would once again shine the international spotlight on Victor Gunnarsson. On Wednesday, October 11th, an analyst for the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation placed a call to Detective May at her office up in the northwest corner of the state. After almost 2 years of reviewing the evidence and material samples that had been collected in the course of the Victor Gunnarsson investigation and finding nothing that would ID the murderer, the forensics expert had been ready to give up. But as he packed away one particular piece of material, he made a completely unexpected discovery. And using a brand new tool for analyzing DNA, the agent now believed he knew who had kidnapped and killed Kay's one-time boyfriend, Victor. Based on the results of that DNA test and the information investigators had gathered over the last 2 years, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Victor Gunnarsson on the night of December 3rd, 1993, and what happened to Catherine Miller 5 days later on the night of December 9th. It was right around midnight, and the moon was covered by clouds when Victor's killer turned into the parking lot at Lakewood Apartments and spotted Victor's big gray Lincoln Town car parked right in front of Unit 910. The killer smiled at the lighted window of Victor's apartment. That was good. That meant the big Swede was still awake. Pulling the burgundy-colored Monte Carlo sedan in as close to Victor's unit as possible, the killer rolled to a stop and turned off the engine. Before leaving the car, the killer checked that they had everything they needed. Then there was the soft clunk as the car door closed, and then the quiet slap of footsteps as the killer walked to the front door of Victor's unit and rang the bell. A moment later, there was the sound of movement inside the apartment, then the doorknob turned, and the big friendly Swede suddenly appeared standing right inside. But the expression of puzzled welcome on Victor's face didn't last long. As soon as the door had opened, the killer was on the move, crowding Victor further back into the house and pulling out the .22 caliber pistol borrowed from a friend. Before Victor even had time to wrap his mind around what had just happened and who was standing inside his home, Victor was being forced out the door of his apartment, bands of tape covering his mouth and binding his hands tightly behind his back. Prodding Victor ahead of him to the Monte Carlo, the killer popped open the trunk and forced Victor to climb inside the cramped compartment, before quickly wrapping Victor's ankles together with more strips of electrical and masking tape. Then there was another clunk as the killer closed the trunk and stepped around to the driver's side, hopped behind the wheel, and turned on the engine. The killer paused just long enough to take a few calming breaths before easing slowly out of the apartment complex, the door to Victor's unit still open. The drive north from Salisbury to the intersection of Route 421 and the Blue Ridge Mountain Parkway took about an hour and 45 minutes. Coming from the rear of the car, the killer could hear the sound of Victor kicking at the top and sides of the trunk and the occasional scrape of something hard that sounded like metal on metal. As the killer approached the entrance ramp to the parkway, they slowed down, pulled over, and then parked the car. Here in the mountains, the edges of the road gave way almost immediately to thick, dense forest. And at this time of the year, when the parkway closed due to winter snow and ice, it could be months or never before anyone wandered into these woods, which was good because that meant the killer could finish this thing without hiking more than 300 or 400 yards into that black tangle of branches. Another calming breath, and the killer had gotten out of the driver's seat, closed the car door, and walked to the trunk. All the thumping and scraping had stopped. Time to pop the trunk, cut the bindings around Victor's ankles, and bring part 1 of the killer's plan to a close. A few minutes later, after forcing Victor to walk ahead at gunpoint up a slight hill, the killer skirted around the edge of a thicket of mountain laurel, then ordered Victor to stop walking. Facing them was the upended root ball of a fallen pine tree. Backing Victor into the shallow depression just in front of the snow-covered roots, the killer ordered Victor to strip off all of his clothes. Then, the killer wrapped a strip of masking and electrical tape around Victor's forehead. Pressing the barrel of the .22 against the tape on the left side of Victor's temple, right at the hairline, the killer pulled the trigger. Once Victor had fallen backward into the snow, the killer crouched down and quickly fired a second shot through the right side of Victor's throat. A moment later, and the killer had picked up the 2 spent shell casings and was pulling off the tape from around Victor's mouth and forehead and hands, and adding the strips with their incriminating load of DNA from Victor's hair and skin to the pile of Victor's clothing. As the killer's adrenaline rush started to wear off, the killer was suddenly shaky and very eager to get out of the dark woods. With any luck, no one would ever see Victor Gunnarsson again. The winter, snow, cold, and wild animals who would scatter his bones all over the forest would make sure of that. As the killer gathered up trace evidence and stood to walk back out to the road, the killer never noticed the 16-inch-long strip of masking and electrical tape they had dropped close to Victor's bare feet. 5 days later, Victor's killer was ready to complete the second part of their plan. All the risks were worth it, because after this, the killer was sure that the life they had wanted and planned would finally be within reach. So, on the evening of December 8th, 1993, the killer knocked at the front door of Catherine Miller's house at 118 Larch Road. The single-story brick ranch was set far back from the road, so anyone driving by would have a hard time recognizing the person who stood with their back to the street at the top of the front steps. After the killer called out and identified themselves, the door opened. Catherine looked surprised and not completely pleased, but she still stepped back to allow her visitor inside. With the same wave of excitement the killer had felt entering Victor's apartment a few days earlier, the killer now pushed quickly into Catherine's living area. The sooner this was done, the better. Pulling out the gun, this time it was a .38 caliber revolver, the killer forced Catherine through the front of her house to the kitchen out back. There was a pan of beans for Catherine's dinner heating on the stove, and a copy of that day's Salisbury Post newspaper lying on the kitchen table. Catherine had turned, and then with no place left to go, she came to a stop with her back pressed against the refrigerator. Then, as the killer closed the distance left between them, Catherine stumbled, slipped, or simply slid down the door of the refrigerator until she was in a sitting position on the floor. Then, standing next to her, the killer fired 2 bullets down into the top of Catherine's head, sending fragments of bones, scalp, and hair in a spray along the floor and ceiling, and leaving a fan of blood spatter against the white refrigerator door. Stepping back, and careful to avoid stepping in any blood, the killer spent a few minutes staging the house to look like Catherine had been the victim of a robbery gone wrong. But the only thing of any value that police would find missing was Catherine's purse. Satisfied with their work, the killer left Catherine's house, returned to their car, started up the engine, and drove away, already thinking ahead to the sequence of events that would begin tomorrow morning. As soon as police discovered Catherine's dead body, they would inform Catherine's daughter, who lived just a few blocks away. And that was the moment when Salisbury police officer L.C. Underwood would be ready to reap the reward of having murdered the 2 people who stood between him and Kay Wheaton, the woman he loved and wanted. With Victor gone, L.C. had eliminated his chief romantic rival, and with Catherine Miller dead, L.C. had eliminated the person closest to Kay, and the person who had never approved of her daughter's involvement with the police officer, who had heard all about how Elsie Underwood had showed up at the restaurant where Kay had met David Sumner for dinner, threatened to hurt both of them, and then dumped a full glass of iced tea right into Kay's lap. Now, with Victor and Catherine dead, not only would Elsie become Kay's indispensable man, Elsie was also the only person who could put an end to the harassment that had made Kay's life miserable ever since she had broken off her engagement to him a little over 1 year earlier. That part would be easy, since it was Elsie himself who had been Kay's stalker all along, sending her those threatening letters he had typed on a typewriter at his work office, and arranging for an ex-convict Elsie knew to harass Kay by phone. Just as it had been so easy for Elsie Underwood to drive by Kay Whedon's house on the night of December 3rd, when Kay and Victor sat holding hands together outside by the fire pit, turn around in the end of her driveway and take down the license number of Victor's car, then call up a buddy on the police force to run the plates and give Elsie Victor's home address. And not only had Elsie been able to use the power of his badge to help commit murder, his job as a police officer would allow him to keep an eye on the investigation into both deaths and stay one step ahead of investigators. But what Elsie Underwood did not expect when he killed both Victor and Catherine was that despite his mania for cleanliness and sanitizing a crime scene, he would leave behind 3 critical pieces of evidence that would eventually lead to his arrest. It would turn out that even before Catherine Miller had been murdered, Salisbury police, who were investigating Kay Whedon's reports that someone was harassing her, had already developed evidence that Kay's own ex-boyfriend, Elsie Underwood, was also Kay's stalker. Police had seized the typewriter ribbon from Elsie's work typewriter at the local high school where he was a resource officer. That typewriter ribbon was the first piece of critical evidence that would eventually tie Elsie to murder. On that typewriter ribbon, police found words that appeared in the letters of harassment that Kay had shown police. Even though Kay herself had refused to believe that Elsie could be her stalker, when Kay's mother, Catherine, was murdered, Elsie, who had been vocal about his run-ins with Catherine, quickly became investigators' primary suspect. But it wasn't until Victor Gunnarson's body was discovered, naked and dead up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, that police were able to collect the second and third pieces of evidence that would send Elsie to prison. When police searched Elsie's house back in February of 1993, almost 2 months after Victor's disappearance, they found a roll of electrical tape that they were later able to identify as the same kind of tape as the strip of tape that police found at the scene of Victor's murder. And during that same search, in the trunk of Elsie's Monte Carlo, there were boot prints and scratches on the underside of the lid. And even though Elsie had had the car thoroughly and professionally cleaned, when detectives sent in the mats from the bottom of the trunk to the state crime lab for examination, forensic specialists would eventually recover 17 hairs embedded in the mat fibers. The call that Detective Paula May had received on October 11, 1995, was confirmation from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab that DNA from all 17 of those hairs found in the trunk of Elsie Underwood's Monte Carlo were a match for Victor Gunnarsson. On October 13, 1995, 1 day after receiving those DNA results, and just under 2 years after Victor disappeared, police arrested 44-year-old police officer Elsie Underwood and charged him with first-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping in the death of Swedish national Victor Gunnarsson. 3.5 years later, on Monday, July 21, 1997, Lamont Claxton Underwood was found guilty of both charges and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Although the court allowed the prosecution to present evidence from Catherine Miller's murder as part of the state's case against Elsie Underwood was never formally charged with Catherine's murder. On Christmas Day 2018, after serving 21 years of his life sentence, Elsie Underwood died in prison of kidney cancer at the age of 67. In June 2020, 34 years after Victor Gunnarsson was questioned as a possible suspect in the assassination of Sweden's Prime Minister Olof Palme, Swedish prosecutors announced that they had finally solved the puzzle of who really did shoot Olof Palme. According to prosecutors, the man, who had no connection to Victor, was a professional graphic designer who had put himself forward at the time of the assassination as an eyewitness to the Prime Minister's death. As for Victor Gunnarsson, twice in his life, the big talker with the big smile was in absolutely the wrong place at absolutely the wrong time. His first piece of bad luck, when he was in a bar nearby the place where Olof Palme was gunned down, resulted in Victor's persecution and his move to the United States. The second piece of bad luck, when he met Kay Whedon, a woman he would date for less than a month, resulted in Victor's death. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are only available on YouTube. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On the day after Thanksgiving in 1998, a police officer responded to a 911 call at an apartment in a Florida beach town. However, the 911 call had been vague, so the officer didn't really know if he was responding to an accident, a break-in, or something else. He knocked on the front door, and nobody answered. He tried the doorknob, but it was locked. So the officer walked around the outside of the apartment, and he found an open window that led into the kitchen. The officer climbed in the window and then made his way through the apartment, and at first, everything looked totally normal. But then he came to a door at the end of a hallway that was slightly cracked open. The officer opened the door, stepped inside, and could not believe what he saw. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Follow Button's bathroom while they're sleeping and replace their toothpaste with superglue. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of November 27, 1998, 25-year-old Corey Parker pulled a pie out of the oven in the kitchen of her first-floor apartment in Jacksonville Beach, Florida. She put the pie down on the counter near the open kitchen window to help it cool. This pie was one of a few that Corey had made in preparation for Thanksgiving, which was the following day. Corey had always loved Thanksgiving, but she was really looking forward to the holiday this year. A few months earlier, she had moved from Rochester, New York to Jacksonville Beach. So this was the first time she'd lived on her own, and the first time she was going to celebrate what she called Friendsgiving. Corey and a bunch of others who weren't spending the holiday with family were all making different Thanksgiving foods and getting together at a friend's house on the holiday. Corey cleaned up the small mess she'd made while baking all day, she walked through the apartment to the bathroom, and she took a shower. After her shower, Corey did her makeup and her hair, and then went to her bedroom closet. She scanned the clothes that were hanging up, and she grabbed a pair of black pants and a blue velvet tank top. Then she picked up her favorite pair of black high heels, stepped into her room, and got dressed. She walked through the apartment, grabbed her keys off the coffee table, and headed outside. Corey locked the door behind her, and then walked down a sidewalk that led past several small apartment buildings just like hers. Each of the buildings looked like an old house that had a few apartments in it. Corey loved this spot in the small beach town where she lived, because this was the first place where she felt like she was truly independent. But she also loved it because the apartments close to hers were home to a lot of other young people. And tonight, Corey saw a bunch of them hanging out outside. She saw people drinking beer and smoking in front of their apartments. Her teenage neighbor from the building behind hers was listening to music on a second-floor balcony, and others were walking to their cars to go out for the night. Corey could also see people who had spent the day drinking at the nearby beach, laughing and stumbling down the street that ran in front of the apartment buildings. The noise and near-constant activity around the apartments drove some people crazy, but Corey liked it when there were a lot of people around. She thought it was fun, but it also made her feel safe to know that she was not out there by herself at night. Because recently, some of the women who lived nearby had caught a peeping Tom watching them through their windows. None of the women had gotten a really good look at him, but they thought he looked like a middle-aged man and that there was a good chance he lived in one of the apartments. But tonight, there were plenty of people out, so Corey didn't worry about some strange man creeping around the apartments trying to spy on young women. Corey stepped off the sidewalk and crossed a small patch of grass to where her car was parked on the street. She got in, started the car, cranked up her stereo, and sped off down the street. She drove for a few blocks and pulled onto a road that ran alongside the beach and was lined with bars and restaurants. This was the town's main drag, and it was already packed with cars and people. Jacksonville Beach was a resort town that hosted a lot of tourists who came to spend time at the beach and to enjoy themselves at all these touristy bars and restaurants down by the water. Corey worked as a waitress at one of those kinds of restaurants, and she enjoyed it. It was exciting getting to meet and talk to people from all over the place, but when Corey and her friends went out, they preferred to go to places where the locals hung out. So Corey pulled off the main drag onto a side street, and a couple of minutes later, she saw the big lit-up sign for her favorite bar and lounge called The Ritz. Corey pulled into the Ritz parking lot, checked her makeup in the rearview mirror, and then got out of her car. As she walked across the parking lot, she could already hear the live music blaring inside. Corey showed her ID to the bouncer at the door, and then she stepped inside the club. And as soon as she did, it was almost like the whole place started moving in slow motion or something, because when Corey walked inside, almost everybody turned to look at her. Corey was 5 foot 11 inches tall, and in her heels, she stood well over 6 feet tall. She was beautiful with long brown hair, and a lot of people who met her, especially when she was dressed up for a night out, just assumed she was a model or an actress. Corey didn't mind the attention, but recently she'd started dating a new guy and it was getting pretty serious. So she wasn't at the club to meet anyone new. She was there to spend time with one of her best friends and just to have a good time. Just then, Corey heard a loud scream over the music coming from somewhere behind her. She turned and her face lit up. One of Corey's best friends, Tiffany Zienta, ran over, wrapped her arms around Corey's waist, and gave her a big hug. Then the two women made their way to the bar and ordered some drinks. And while they waited, they talked about their plans for Thanksgiving. And Corey said how excited she was for Friendsgiving. Tiffany said she was a bit jealous. She was spending the holiday with her parents, which was okay, but spending time with Corey and other people their age sounded way more fun. The bartender came over and handed Corey and Tiffany their drinks. The two women raised their glasses, downed the drinks, and cheered on the band playing. At 1:30 a.m. on November 28th, so a few hours after Corey had arrived at the Ritz, she got into her car and started driving home. She knew she had a big day ahead of her, so she had kept her drinking to a minimum. That's why she had passed when Tiffany had asked her to stay out a bit later and go bar hopping with them before heading home for the night. Tiffany was bummed, but Corey knew she did not want to be completely exhausted for Thanksgiving. Corey drove down the street in front of her building, parked her car, and stepped outside. She walked down the sidewalk to her apartment, and as she did, she felt herself tense up a bit. It was a lot quieter than it had been when she left, and nobody else seemed to be around. Corey approached her apartment, and she saw a few people out on their balconies in the buildings next to hers and behind hers, and this made her relax a bit. She unlocked her front door, went inside, and locked the door behind her. Then she dropped her keys on the coffee table and went to her bedroom. She slipped off her heels and tossed the shoes and her purse onto the floor, and then she got undressed, climbed into bed, and fell asleep pretty quickly. But just a little later, Corey woke up, startled. It was dark and she was disoriented, but she thought she heard someone breathing. At 11 a.m. on November 29th, so the day after Thanksgiving, a cook at a Jacksonville Beach restaurant prepped his station in the kitchen, getting ready for the lunchtime rush. The cook glanced at his watch and stopped what he was doing. He walked out of the kitchen and scanned the restaurant floor, and he got worried when he didn't see Corey. The cook and Corey not only worked together, but they were also friends, and so they would let each other know if they were going to miss a shift. So the cook quickly met with some of the waiters and other kitchen staff to see if any of them had seen or heard from Corey this morning, but none of them had. And one of the waitresses said she was really concerned because she had called Corey the day before when she had heard from a mutual friend that Corey had not shown up for Friendsgiving. The restaurant manager came over and he said he was worried too. He tried calling Corey a couple of times this morning and hadn't heard back, and it was not like her to just blow off a shift without calling in. The manager asked the cook if he knew where Corey lived. The cook said he did, so the manager asked him to go by Corey's place to check on her and make sure she was okay. The cook took off his apron and then walked out to his car and sped out of the parking lot. A few minutes later, he arrived at Corey's apartment. He went up to the front door and knocked, but nobody answered. He knocked again, but it didn't sound like anybody was inside the apartment. And so the cook walked around the apartment to the back, and he found Corey's bedroom window. He looked inside, and he could see part of Corey's room through a small opening in the blinds. He thought he saw Corey, or at least her legs, lying in her bed. He knocked on the glass and waited, but he didn't see any movement inside. So he pressed his face right up against the window to get a better look, and immediately he felt his heart start to race. He turned away from the window and ran as fast as he could back to his car and sped back to the restaurant. The cook ran inside, and the manager and the other staff members could tell something was obviously wrong, but the cook didn't even say a word. Instead, he ran to the front counter, grabbed the phone, and dialed 911. A few minutes later, 2 Jacksonville Beach police officers arrived at Corey's apartment. The call they had gotten from dispatch had been kind of vague, because the young man who had called 911 said he really hadn't seen much. Apparently, he'd looked through a small opening in the window blinds, and he thought he saw his friend laying in bed. And he thought he saw blood on her foot. So the officers didn't really know if they were dealing with a potential accident, a violent crime, or if the caller had just panicked and dialed 911 without really even seeing anything. And so the officers walked up to Corey's front door, and they knocked, but nobody answered. One of them tried the doorknob, but it was locked. So they walked around the side of the apartment, and they saw that the kitchen window was open. One of the officers told his partner to wait right there by the side of the house, and he said he would check out the apartment. Then he put on a pair of gloves, opened up the window a bit more, and then climbed through the opening into the kitchen. Once inside the apartment, the officer called out and introduced himself as a police officer in case anyone was home. But nobody responded. It was totally silent. And so he began looking around the kitchen, but there was nothing there that looked strange. There was no sign of a robbery or a struggle, and then also he checked the front room of the apartment, and there also was nothing there. And so he walked to the back of the apartment where Corey's bedroom was. The officer got to the bedroom door, and he saw it was slightly cracked open. Before opening it, he called out one more time, not wanting to frighten anybody if they were sleeping in the room, but there still wasn't any response. And so the officer opened the bedroom door, looked into the room, and was absolutely horrified by what he found. Minutes later, detectives Katie Kingston and Billy Carlisle arrived at Corey's apartment. They were followed by several uniformed police officers and a forensics team. Kingston and Carlisle ducked under the crime scene tape that had been strung up across Corey's front door. They walked inside and quickly found their way to the bedroom. The detectives stepped into the room, and immediately they felt just as shocked as the officer who had first arrived on scene. A young woman lay in bed, propped up against the headboard. She was completely naked, and her whole body was covered in blood. And there was so much blood spatter on the wall behind the bed that it looked like someone had thrown a bucket of red paint against the wall. As Detective Kingston walked closer to the bed, she could barely wrap her mind around what she was looking at. This poor young woman had sustained an unthinkable number of stab wounds. Then Kingston noticed something laying on the bed next to Corey. Now at first, it just looked like another bloodstain, but Kingston leaned down and saw that it was actually a pair of bloody women's underwear. Kingston heard her name, and she turned to see Carlisle crouched over, looking at something on the floor near the bed. She went over to him, and she saw he had found a gold cigarette lighter. The detectives walked the rest of the room, but other than the lighter and the underwear, nothing really jumped out at them. They saw some clothes and shoes on the floor, but they were not drenched in blood like the underwear. The detectives also found a purse in the bedroom with a driver's license inside, and so they were able to officially identify the victim as Corey Parker. Kingston and Carlisle stepped aside and let a couple of forensics officers get to work in the bedroom. The forensics officers were able to take multiple blood samples, but the investigators realized there was a chance that all this blood was the victim's, not the killer's. Then one of the forensics officers looked more closely at Corey's body, and he said the medical examiner would have to weigh in, but he didn't see any signs of sexual assault. And so Kingston and Carlisle theorized that, maybe Corey had just gone to bed naked, or maybe the killer had stripped off her underwear either during the attack or afterwards for some unknown reason. The forensics officer motioned for the two detectives to look, and when they leaned down, they saw a strand of hair on Corey's underwear, and it definitely did not match Corey's. And so the detectives believed that, given the location of this piece of hair on her underwear, and the insane level of violence inflicted on Corey,
meant they were most likely looking for a current or former intimate partner. Throughout the afternoon, the investigative team searched the apartment and the surrounding area, and the detectives caught something that the first officers on the scene had missed. There were drops of blood on the kitchen counter and on the outside kitchen windowsill. The officers that arrived first had told Kingston and Carlisle that the kitchen window had been open when they got there. That's how they got inside. And so the detectives imagined that this is where the killer must have entered and exited the apartment. And so they hoped that the blood on the counter and the windowsill belonged to the killer. The forensics team took blood samples from both of those spots and prepped them to be sent to the lab along with the blood samples from the bedroom and the strand of hair they'd found on the underwear. In 1998, DNA testing was starting to evolve, but the process was still slow, and it was not always as effective as it is today. So Kingston and Carlisle knew they could be waiting a while for any test results, and that those results might not tell them anything. In the meantime, they wanted to speak to people who might have seen something that night or who knew Corey well. That afternoon, the detectives canvassed the apartment buildings nearby, and several people who had been on their balconies or in front of their apartments thought they had seen Corey leaving her apartment the night before Thanksgiving. And none of them had seen or heard anything strange in that area over the past 2 days. One neighbor also said she had met Corey's new boyfriend, and she provided enough information that an officer back at the station was able to quickly track him down. And it turned out the boyfriend was away visiting his family for Thanksgiving, and the officer was able to find proof that he had taken a flight days before Corey was killed, so detectives Carlisle and Kingston did not consider the boyfriend a prime suspect. But Corey could have been seeing someone else, or she could have had ex-lovers who were jealous about her new relationship. So, after getting confirmation about the boyfriend's alibi, Kingston and Carlisle got in their car and drove a few blocks away to the restaurant where Corey had worked, hoping one of her coworkers might have additional information about Corey's personal life. They walked in, and the whole place felt like something heavy was hanging over it. The staff were going about their jobs, but it was obvious they were all waiting for news on their friend, Corey. Kingston and Carlisle pulled the manager into the kitchen, and the manager quickly waved over the cook who had called 911. Then the detectives told them that Corey had unfortunately been found dead inside of her apartment. The cook immediately started crying, and the manager closed his eyes and tried to fight back tears. Kingston told them the police would need to talk to everybody at the restaurant who knew Corey, but for now, they wanted to know if there was somebody working there who might have had an intimate relationship with Corey, a boyfriend or even a casual fling. The manager and the cook looked at each other like they were thinking the same thing. The cook said Corey was not actively seeing anybody from the restaurant, but there was a dishwasher who worked there named Eric Ely who wished he had a relationship with Corey. Detective Carlisle asked if he meant that this guy Eric had a crush on Corey, but the cook just shook his head and told the detectives that Eric did not just have a crush on Corey. He was completely obsessed with her. The following day, detectives Kingston and Carlisle sat in an interview room waiting for the dishwasher, Eric Ely, to arrive. Eric had not been at the restaurant the previous day when the detectives were there, but they had spoken to several other staff members about him, and almost all of the women they spoke to at the restaurant said the same thing. Eric was a total creep, and he harassed Corey way more than he harassed anybody else. An officer led Eric into the interview room, and he took a seat across from the detectives. Eric was in his 20s, he had long light brown hair, and as he sat down, he smiled at the detectives. Eric already knew that Corey had been killed, and so Kingston didn't waste any time with pleasantries. She wanted to press Eric right from the start. She leaned across the table and asked Eric point blank if it was true that he was obsessed with Corey. Eric smiled a bit wider and said maybe he was a little obsessed, but Kingston immediately went after him. She said police knew he was more than just a little obsessed. They knew that he had asked Corey on multiple occasions to spend Thanksgiving alone with him, and that even after she turned him down every time, Eric had made a huge Thanksgiving feast and then planned to try to guilt her into coming to his apartment. The smile on Eric's face disappeared. He looked at Kingston and admitted that he was completely obsessed with Corey. But he said he just wanted to spend time with her. He would never hurt her. But then Eric said something that took the detectives by complete surprise. He asked them how Corey was killed. Without missing a beat, Carlisle asked Eric how he thought Corey might have been killed. And Eric immediately got this look on his face like he was having a daydream or something, and then he said he thought the killer probably attacked Corey while she was tired or sleeping and stabbed her. The detectives both looked stunned. Eric had just described, at least in a general way, how Corey had actually been murdered. So Kingston said it sounded like Eric knew a lot about the murder. And what Eric said next stunned the detectives even more. Eric smiled again and told them that maybe he knew how the killer did it because he had fantasized about doing the same things. Kingston asked in a calm voice what kind of fantasies Eric had, and Eric said sometimes he fantasized about raping and murdering women. But before the detectives could even react, Eric said those were just fantasies. He never acted on them, and he never hurt Corey. Kingston and Carlisle talked to Eric for a while longer, and then they ended the interview. They told him he could go, but they made it clear he should not leave town. An officer came in and escorted Eric out of the interview room, and for a second, Kingston and Carlisle just sat there without talking. Neither of them had ever had an interview go like this. They'd never seen anyone discuss their secret desire to rape and kill so easily, especially when they were claiming they didn't do anything. There was no question in their minds that Eric was their best lead by far, but they also knew that they couldn't arrest him just because he had dark and violent thoughts. So they just hoped when the DNA results came in, they would have a clearer idea if Eric was the killer. But in the meantime, they wanted to get a better idea of Corey's last few hours alive. So they talked to some of her friends and eventually tracked down Tiffany Zienta, Corey's friend who had been at the Ritz with her on the night before Thanksgiving, and as far as police knew, was the last person to see Corey alive. In the week following Corey's murder, Kingston and Carlisle sat down with Tiffany in the same interview room where they had met with Eric. But the situation was a lot more relaxed, and the detectives told Tiffany they were just trying to get a better picture of Corey's movements on the night before Thanksgiving. Tiffany told them she had met Corey at the club and said they went there together a lot. And then, without any prompting, Tiffany started talking about how beautiful Corey was and what an amazing person she was, and how being around her was just different than being around other people. The detective smiled, nodded, and listened, but both of them thought the same thing. It was completely normal for someone to talk about how great and how pretty one of their friends was, but something in the way Tiffany spoke about Corey felt different than that. So when Tiffany stopped talking, Kingston asked if she and Corey had been more than just friends. Did they ever have an intimate relationship? But Tiffany shook her head and almost laughed. She said no, she and Corey were just really good friends, they had a lot in common, and they loved hanging out together. Then Kingston asked when Tiffany had last seen Corey. At this, Tiffany lowered her head, and it was clear she was starting to cry. She said they left the club sometime around 1:30 a.m., and she asked Corey to go have some late-night drinks with her and a few other friends, but Corey had said she just wanted to go home. Tiffany said she called Corey around 2:15 a.m. just to make sure she had gotten home safely, but nobody answered. Tiffany figured Corey had already gone to bed, and so that's why she didn't try calling back again. The detectives thanked Tiffany for coming in and told her they would follow up with her soon. Tiffany said she would do everything she could to help, and then she left. But in the days following the interview, the detectives worked with the phone company and retrieved all of Corey's recent phone records, and despite what Tiffany had said, there was no record of her calling Corey at 2:15 a.m. or any time after they supposedly left the club. And so after finding that out, Kingston and Carlisle wanted to speak to Tiffany again right away. But when they called Tiffany, they discovered she had left town. And soon after that, they were told by the lawyer she'd just hired that Tiffany would no longer help with their investigation. Detectives Kingston and Carlisle spent the next few weeks pursuing any lead that might provide more information on the obsessed dishwasher Eric or on Corey's friend Tiffany. And they had conversations with a lot of different people that made both of their suspects seem totally viable. But the detectives still did not have any concrete evidence linking either suspect to the crime scene or to Corey's murder. Then, Kingston and Carlisle finally got the test results back that they had been waiting for from the crime lab. And these tests showed that DNA from the hair found on Corey's underwear and from the blood on the kitchen counter and the outside kitchen windowsill belonged to the same person. And that person was not Corey. But the DNA did not match any samples the crime lab had on file or any samples that had been entered into the FBI's national DNA database. So this meant the police had proof that another person had been in Corey's apartment on the night she was killed, but they had no idea who that person was. Still, Kingston and Carlisle thought they were getting close to finding the killer, and after several more interviews, they believed they had zeroed in on one particular suspect and that they had enough proof to arrest someone. However, the district attorney did not agree. He told them that without proof of who the DNA found in the house belonged to, or some other smoking gun, this case would never hold up in court. This news from the district attorney felt like a gut punch to Kingston and Carlisle, and no matter who they talked to or what information they got, they could not find the type of evidence that would enable them to make an arrest. And so the investigation started to slow down, and Kingston and Carlisle started to run out of options. The case remained open, but it was no longer the department's top priority, and Kingston and Carlisle had to focus on other work. In late May of 2000, about 18 months after Corey's murder, a man named William Rensler sat on the dock of a lake near Jacksonville Beach, fishing with two of his friends. Rensler referred to himself as a fugitive specialist, but most people called him a bounty hunter. Rensler had tracked down criminals and bail jumpers, and he was skilled at finding people who had seemingly disappeared. Recently, Jacksonville Beach Police had put up a reward of $20,000 for anyone who could provide information that would lead to an arrest in Corey's murder. And once Rensler started looking into the past investigation, he became confident he could close the case, bring Corey's family some peace, and collect the reward money. Rensler laid his fishing rod down on the dock. He grabbed a beer from a cooler sitting next to him, he cracked it open, and then pulled out a thick file folder from his leather bag. He sipped from his beer and started looking over his notes on Corey's murder. Rensler's two friends, like everybody in town, knew about the case. They took a seat next to Rensler on the dock, they each grabbed a beer too, and asked him how it was going. Was he close to finding the killer? Rensler said he had interviewed a bunch of people connected to the case, but there was one person he really wanted to talk to that he just couldn't find. He pointed to this person's name in his notes, and both of his friends almost spit out their drinks. Rensler asked what was going on, and his friends said they both knew the person he was looking for because they had worked with them at a restaurant, and they told Rensler there was something really weird about this person. Rensler's friends said this person had come into the restaurant one day and said they had to quit and leave town immediately because their child had tragically died in Texas. Rensler asked, what was so weird about that? That sounded horrible. But one of his friends said he had gotten to know this person pretty well, and he was almost positive that they did not have children. Rensler took a swig of his beer and then asked his friends if they remembered when all this happened. And one of them said, this person he was looking for had left town around Thanksgiving about 1.5 years ago, not long after Corey Parker's murder. It would take a couple of months, but Rensler, the fugitive specialist, tracked down this person who had skipped town soon after Corey's murder. Rensler had traced their movements to Texas and then eventually discovered they had moved to a town in Maryland about 800 miles away from Jacksonville Beach. Once Rensler had this information, he informed detectives Kingston and Carlisle where this possible suspect was now living, and the detectives caught the next flight to Maryland to try to secure a DNA sample. On July 26, 2000, so 20 months after Corey's murder, Kingston and Carlisle sat in an unmarked car in Easton, Maryland, with a local police officer. The detectives were watching the suspect who was smoking a cigarette in a parking lot while on a break from work. And Kingston and Carlisle could not believe their luck. A discarded cigarette butt was perfect for getting a DNA sample, because the suspect's spit and saliva would be all over it. And so they watched their suspect smoke for several minutes, and when it looked like the cigarette was about to be out and they might flick it onto the ground, they felt this surge of adrenaline. But then, Kingston and Carlisle watched in horror as the suspect carefully put the cigarette out on the ground and then slipped the butt behind their ear. The detectives looked at each other. The suspect very likely knew they were being tailed by the police. The suspect turned to walk back into work, but before opening the door, they leaned down a little and spit on the ground. Kingston and Carlisle practically wanted to start cheering. They waited for the suspect to go inside, and then Carlisle got out of the car, ran across the parking lot, collected the spit off the ground, and ran back to the car. A little bit later, Kingston, Carlisle, and local police officers delivered that sample to the FBI's DNA lab, which is only about 70 miles from where they were. And when the FBI conducted their tests, they were able to match the DNA from the suspect's spit to the DNA samples taken from the hair and blood found in Corey's apartment. The fugitive specialist, the bounty hunter, William Rensler, had indeed led the detectives right to Corey's killer. Based on DNA testing, crime scene evidence, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Corey Parker in the early morning hours of November 28, 1998. At about 2 a.m., the killer crept towards Corey's apartment, trying their best to stay low and out of any lights that were shining from people's porches and balconies. The killer made their way around Corey's apartment to the kitchen window, and it was still open. So, quietly, the killer climbed in through the window and into the kitchen. The whole apartment was dark, but the killer knew their way around well enough. So they walked through the front room and down a short hallway to Corey's bedroom. They reached the bedroom door, and it was cracked open. The killer took a breath and opened the door just a little more and stepped into the bedroom. In the light coming through the window, the killer could see Corey sleeping in her bed, and they saw Corey's underwear laying near her leg on top of the comforter. The killer got excited and started breathing heavily. Then suddenly, Corey woke up. She heard someone breathing and saw a shadow near the foot of her bed, but before she could scream, the killer lunged at the bed and ripped the comforter off of Corey. The killer could see she was naked, and they leapt on top of her. The killer pinned Corey down, but Corey's arms were long and she was fast, and she fought back. The killer didn't see it, but in the struggle, their gold cigarette lighter tumbled out of their pocket and onto the floor. Corey slashed her hands and nails at the killer and cut into the palm of their hand and ripped at their hair. Then the killer grabbed Corey's head and slammed it against the headboard. With Corey suddenly stunned and woozy, the killer reached down and covered her mouth with one hand and reached around and grabbed the knife out of their pocket with the other. Then the killer raised the knife, and Corey put up her arms to try to defend herself, but the killer just cut at her arms, knocking them out of the way. Then the killer raised the knife again and stabbed Corey in the chest. The killer pulled the knife back up and stabbed her in the chest again and again, and Corey's body went limp and slumped against the headboard. But the killer did not stop. They kept stabbing as blood splashed onto the wall and ran down Corey's body onto the bed. Finally, the killer did stop, and they looked down at Corey. They had just stabbed her 101 times. The killer climbed off the bed and staggered back. They could barely think or see straight, but they made their way out of the bedroom and through the apartment. They walked into the kitchen, steadied themselves on the counter for a second, and then they climbed through the open window, leaving a little bit of blood on the windowsill. Once outside, the killer crouched back down and rushed through the darkness to the apartment building right behind Corey's. It would turn out the obsessed dishwasher, Eric, who had admitted to having fantasies about rape and murder, did not kill Corey. And neither did her close friend Tiffany, who police thought might have been infatuated with Corey. In fact, the killer was not somebody who police had suspected early on. It was a 17-year-old named Robert Denny, Corey's teenage neighbor who often hung out on his second-floor balcony in the apartment building right behind Corey's. Robert was not the peeping Tom who had been spotted in the area, but he did spend a lot of time spying on Corey. From his balcony, he could watch her in her apartment or when she went out to sit on her back porch. Police had talked to Robert when they talked to Corey's other neighbors, but he didn't seem to know her, and his age played in his favor. Police simply didn't believe that this crime had been carried out by a teenager. But when police later discovered that Robert had left town not long after the murder, they did start to reconsider their thoughts about him. And they even wanted to arrest him, but the district attorney did not believe they had enough evidence to make the case stick. When the fugitive expert, William Rensler, learned from his friends that Robert had given a really bizarre reason for leaving town so soon after Corey's murder, Rensler became convinced that Robert had killed Corey. Soon, Rensler tracked Robert down and told Detectives Kingston and Carlisle everything he had learned about the young man. And so, the detectives headed to Maryland and secured the DNA sample from Robert's spit that matched with the DNA samples found inside of Corey's apartment. In addition to those samples, one of Robert's ex-girlfriends came forward and told police that the gold cigarette lighter found in Corey's apartment belonged to Robert. And finally, detectives discovered that Robert's own brother was in a Texas prison for murdering a woman by stabbing her 98 times. And authorities came to believe that by stabbing Corey 101 times, Robert was just trying to outdo his brother. Robert was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To this day, he maintains his innocence. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you liked today's story and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, the MrBallen podcast. We also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories, just like the one you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.